I've studied paint a picture that's both more mundane and more extraordinary than the glittering tapestries and epic poems would have you believe. Knights in polished armor, the noble quests for holy relics, the grand pronouncements of chivalry, are the stories told by the victors, or perhaps the stories told by those who they wish they had been victors. You and I, however, peel back those layers of romanticism to feel the grit and the grime, to understand the raw, often brutal, for an ordinary person during the Crusades. And nowhere is that reality more starkly, more horrifically revealed than in the simple, desperate act of trying to eat. You wake up, gentle chirping of birds or the soft glow of dawn filtering through a modern window, chill that seeps into your very bones. The rough wool of your tunic scratches against your skin, a constant reminder of your circumstances. The air thick with the pungent odor of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, something vaguely animalistic catches in your throat. You open your eyes to a low, dark tent, stained with mildew, and the shadows dancing with the flickering light of a dying ember in a small brazier. Outside, cacophony, the restless shuffling of feet, the occasional guttural cough, the distant, mournful cry of a donkey. Battlefield, yet not today. This is simply Tuesday, somewhere in the kingdom of Jerusalem, around the year 1189. Your stomach clenches a familiar, hollow ache. It's not the gnawing hunger of a skipped meal. It's a deep, persistent emptiness that has become a constant companion. You reach for your water skin, the leather cracked and stiff. Within is lukewarm, tasting faintly of the clay it was stored in, and if you're being honest, a hint of something you'd rather identify. It slakes your thirst, but does nothing for the gnawing emptiness. You shift, protesting. The ground beneath you is packed earth, littered with straw that crunches unpleasantly as you move. Pull on your worn leather boots, their soles thin and offering little protection from the uneven terrain. The tunic you wear is coarse, a dull brown that offers no comfort, no aesthetic pleasure. It's merely functional, a barrier against the elements and the prying eyes of others. You emerge from the tent in the harsh sunlight that seems to offer more glare than warmth. The camp stretches out before you, a sprawling tents, makeshift shelters, and tethered horses. Dust coats everything, a fine, irritates your eyes and gets into your mouth with every breath. You see a group of men huddled around a small fire, gaunt and etched with weariness. Their conversation is low, punctuated by sighs and the clinking of metal. You approach, hoping for a morsel, a shared ration, anything. "Brother Thomas," you call out, your voice rough from disuse and the dry air, "to share this morning." I, a man with a patchy beard and eyes that seem too large for his face, looks up. He's stirring a pot over the fire, a thin greyish gruel bubbling sluggishly. The smell is uninspiring. "God's peace, Brother John. Only this meagre pottage, barley mostly, and whatever roots we could find yesterday, a few scraps of dried meat, He gestures with a wooden spoon, the metal of his own meagre bowl tarnished and dented. As he ladles a small portion into your own bowl, the same rough earthenware as his, the gruel is watery, lumpy, bland, almost earthy. Its sustenance, yes, far cry from the hearty stews or roasted meats you might have imagined. This is what fuels a crusade, reality of the daily grind. You begin to understand that the romanticized image of crusader life, with broad strokes of piety and glory, completely overlooks the fundamental struggle for survival when it came to food. For the vast majority of crusaders, the common foot soldiers, the laborers, the pilgrims who joined the ranks, food was not a matter of choice or culinary delight. It was a constant, desperate pursuit. Logistics of feeding an army on the move, an army traversing vast distances through unfamiliar and often hostile territories like the Holy Land, were a nightmare, notoriously difficult to maintain. Imagine trying to transport food across hundreds, even thousands of miles, unpack animals that were themselves susceptible to disease, starvation, and raids. Sheer spoilage of food in the sweltering heat of the Levant was a constant problem. Fresh meat was a luxury, and even preserved meats could turn rancid. I discovered in the archives of the Abbey of Saint Cernin in Toulouse letters from a minor knight who participated in the Third Crusade under Richard the Lionheart. Not of battlefield heroics, but of the gnawing hunger that accompanied them. He describes days where the only sustenance was hard, often infested with weevils, and water that was brackish or stagnant. The desperate measures taken to supplement their rations, foraging for edible plants, hunting small game, and even circumstances resorting to eating the very animals that pulled their carts. You take another spoonful of the gruel, trying to ignore the gritty texture. You remember hearing tales of the siege of Antioch during the First Crusade, a period of extreme hardship. Food became so scarce that people resorted to eating boiled leather from their belts, the soles of their shoes, own horses. The accounts speak of men gnawing on bones stripped clean, their bodies racked with hunger pangs, and one that makes the lukewarm gruel in your bowl seem like a feast. Later that day, find yourself in the bustling, albeit grimy, marketplace of Acre. The air here is a thick soup of smells, the sharp tang of spices, the cloying sweetness of overripe fruit, the pungent aroma of fish, and underlying it all, the ever-present scent of sewage and animal dung. Hawk their wares, their voices a constant drone. You see piles of dates, sticky and dark, and rough loaves of bread, stones than food. You approach a stall where a woman, her face weathered and lined, is selling dried figs. Her hands, with the juice of the fruit, move with practiced efficiency. You have a few small copper coins saved from your meager rations. "Honored lady," you say, holding out your coins. A handful of these figs. She eyes you, her gaze sharp and assessing. "From the north, are you?" she asks, her accent thick. You look it. The journey has not been kind. She scoops a generous handful of the figs into a small cloth bag. The figs are shriveled, dusty, and some have tiny holes in them, likely from insects, but they are sweet, intensely sweet, concentrated energy that momentarily banishes the hollowness. "We have been on the road many months." You admit the fare has been challenging. She nods, a knowing look in her eyes. I hear the stories. The water is foul. Many grow sick. "Here," she says, reaching into a basket and pulling out a small, wrinkled apple. "Take it. It is not perfect, but it will do." You accept the apple, its skin bruised and slightly soft, faint warmth of the sun still lingering within it. It's a small gesture, but in this world of constant scarcity, such kindness is a precious commodity. You thank her profusely, the sweetness of the figs already a welcome contrast to the blandness of the morning's meal. Understand that the diet of a crusader was incredibly monotonous and often nutritionally deficient. Foods were grain, barley, wheat, and oats, usually ground into flour for bread or cooked as a porridge or gruel. Pulses like lentils and beans were also common. Fruits and vegetables were seasonal and often spoiled quickly, difficult to transport. Meat was a rarity for most, reserved for feast days or when successful hunting or foraging occurred, available near coastal areas. But again, preservation was a challenge. preserved foods meant a diet high in carbohydrates and low in essential vitamins and minerals. This deficiency contributed to a host of health problems, including scurvy, anemia, and general weakness. Crusaders, more susceptible to disease, and disease often more than the sword, was the true killer on these campaigns. Dysentery, fever, and plague were rampant in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the camps and siege lines. You sit under the shade of a scraggly olive tree, the rough bark pressing into your back. You nibble on a dried fig, sweetness a momentary reprieve. You look at the other figures scattered around the camp, etched with the same weariness you feel. You hear the distant clatter of armor being prepared, the muted orders being shouted. Another day begins, and with it, the same struggle to find enough to eat. Of Jerusalem feels very far away when your stomach is empty and your body is weak. Notion of a holy war fades with each gnawing pang of hunger, replaced by the stark, undeniable reality of survival. Begins its descent, casting long shadows across the dusty plains. You contemplate the journey ahead. The march will take you through arid lands where water is scarce and foraging even more difficult. The thought of what you might have to eat, or more importantly, what you won't have to eat, settles in your gut like a cold stone. Almost taste the desperation. Most people think they understand this historical period, but nothing could be further from the truth. Tapestries and heroic bark ballads of the Crusades, the ones that fill your mind with images of shining armor and righteous fury. Illusion. They obscure a far more visceral and, dare I say, stomach-churning reality. You've glimpsed the shattering of that illusion in the dusty archives, seen how the grand pronouncements of faith often masks the gnawing anxieties of the common soldier. Now, let's pull back the curtain further to the fundamental biological imperative that undergirded every mile marched, every battle fought, not the peckish kind that a mid-afternoon snack can assuage, but a deep, primal, all-consuming void that dictated strategy and ultimately decided fates. Imagine, if you can, the sheer, unadulterated scale. We're not talking about a few hundred men. We're talking about tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, from disparate corners of Christendom. The First Crusade, launched in 1095 by Pope Urban II, wasn't a single, unified army. Series of waves, a chaotic surge of humanity. The People's Crusade, an unruly mob of peasants and commoners, the more organized, albeit still loosely knit, armies of the princes. Picture this: you are a farmer from Champagne, caroused from years of tilling soil, your diet a predictable rotation of coarse bread, root vegetables, a bit of salted pork, if you were fortunate. Suddenly, you're swept up in a fervor, a promise of salvation and plunder. Find yourself marching east, towards a land you can barely pronounce the name of, with little more than the clothes on your back and a desperate hope. Feeding such a multitude is almost incomprehensible by modern standards. We, to supermarkets and refrigerated trucks, can scarcely fathom the challenges. Your daily sustenance, foot soldier in the Crusades, was a precarious gamble. The primary staples were grain, wheat, or barley ground into flour to make bread or gruel. This grain had to be sourced, transported, processed. Think of the vast quantities needed. A single man, even on a meager diet, consumes a significant amount of calories per day. Multiply that by, say, 50,000 men. That's an astronomical amount of grain. It wasn't just grain. Dried beans, lentils, and salted meat were crucial for protein, but these were also bulky and perishable, especially in the heat of the Levant. As days blur into weeks, the constant, gnawing hunger becomes your closest companion. With a hollow ache in your belly, the taste of stale bread if you're lucky, already coating your tongue. The air, smell of unwashed bodies, horse dung and damp wool, also carries the faint, tantalizing scent of wood smoke. Perhaps a meal. You see the carts laden with sacks of grain, rumbling along behind the main body of the army. These are the lifeblood, the fragile arteries that feed the war machine. But these carts are vulnerable. They are slow, they are targets for opportunistic bandits or enemy skirmishers, dependent on the land through which they pass. If the harvest has been poor, or if the local populace is hostile, will arrive lighter or not at all. I discovered in the archives a fascinating, albeit grim, the first crusade detailing the desperate measures taken when supplies dwindled. One chronicler, Fulcher of Chartres, of the army reaching cities like Nicaea in 1097, where the inhabitants, under siege themselves, provide adequate provisions. The soldiers, driven to desperation, resorted to foraging for anything edible, on tree bark, digging up roots that were likely bitter and indigestible, and, in the most horrific instances, fallen comrades. The smell of decay, already pervasive in a large army camp, would become even more pungent. Constant reminder of the fine line between life and death, between sustenance and cannibalism. The very air you breathed, the dust of the road and the sweat of thousands, would also carry the subtle blood and the sickly, sweet odor of putrefaction. Let's imagine a specific scene. Part of Godfrey of Bouillon's contingent, marching through Anatolia in the summer of 1097. The sun beats down relentlessly, dusty plains into a shimmering mirage. Your woolen tunic, even though it's meant to be breathable, clings to your skin. Sweat, your mouth is parched, your tongue feeling thick and furry. You clutch your worn leather waterskin, precious liquid. The cool, slightly metallic taste, a temporary reprieve. Your stomach cramps, a familiar, unwelcome sensation. You've eaten your day's ration of hardtack, a dense, leavened biscuit that could break a tooth if you weren't careful hours ago. Now, the hunger is a sharp, insistent ache. Conversation with two fellow soldiers. Souls, there's Jean, a gruff blacksmith from Normandy, his face permanently smudged with soot, gnarled oak roots. He's gnawing on a piece of dried meat, so tough it's almost impossible to chew. By the saints, gnawing on a saddle, he grumbles, his voice raspy. If we don't find water soon, moan blood. Beside him, young Pierre, a farmer's son barely out of his teens, his face pale and gaunt. I heard at the horizon. I heard a rumor, he whispers, his voice thin, that the locals ahead have olives and figs. Jean snorts, a sound like a rusty hinge. More likely they'll have spears and rocks for us. Remember what happened near Dorilium? We were starving, and when we finally met the Turks, a slaughter because we're too weak to fight properly. This is the reality. Hunger wasn't just an inconvenience, strategic liability. Weakened soldiers were more susceptible to disease, less effective in combat, and prone to desertion or mutiny. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who had requested help from the west against the Seljuk Turks, was acutely aware of this. His own armies, though better supplied and organized, still faced immense challenges. He had to ensure that the crusading armies, once they reached Byzantine territory, could be provisioned to some degree, lest they turn on his own people. The initial agreement was that the Crusaders would be supplied with food and water in exchange for their service. The sheer number of people involved and the unpredictable nature of their arrival strained even the Byzantine infrastructure. Logistics of animal feed. These armies weren't just men, they were also supported by thousands of horses, mules, and oxen. needed fodder, hay, barley, oats, and water. Without healthy pack animals, supply of food and equipment would grind to a halt. Imagine the vast swaths of land that had to be traversed, the constant need to find grazing and water sources, not just for the men, but for their beasts of burden as well. A single will consume as much as 10-15 kilograms of hay and a significant amount of grain daily. Multiply that by, say, 10,000 horses. Feed required is staggering. This was a constant concern, a silent predator stalking the army's progress. Monologue, as you trudge along, is a constant negotiation with your own body. The gnawing in your stomach is a dull roar, sharp pangs. You try to focus on the promises of the Holy Land, the divine mandate. Urge for sustenance keeps pulling you back to the immediate, the desperate need for a handful of grain, a sip of clean water. You see other soldiers, their faces gun eyes hollow, their movements slow and wary. A knowing glance with a man beside you, a silent acknowledgement of the shared suffering, the unspoken question, longer can we endure this? The taste of the gritty bread you've managed to procure is bland, almost chalky, with a desperate gratitude, letting each crumb dissolve in your mouth, trying to extract every last calorie. The smell of the campfire as evening approaches is a welcome comfort. The aroma of whatever meagre stew is being prepared, perhaps some dried lentils, a few tough roots, exceptionally lucky, a sliver of salted pork. The textures are rough, the flavors muted, but it's food. It's a temporary silencing of the ever-present hunger. The reality of feeding these massive armies was a constant calculus of supply and demand, of endurance and desperation. It was a logistical feat that, by modern standards, miraculous that it was achieved at all, and a testament to the sheer, unyielding will of the people who undertook these arduous journeys. But the cost, the constant, soul-crushing hunger, price paid to blood, sweat, and the very essence of human endurance. And as the sun dips below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the parched earth, you can't help but wonder what fresh horrors tomorrow's hunger will bring. Ahead is long, and the empty ache in your belly is a constant reminder of the fundamental struggle for survival that lay at the heart of the Crusades, overshadowed the lofty ideals of faith and glory. Smoke drifts through your consciousness as we begin this journey. It's a primal smell, ancient and comforting, yet here, nay, need. You inhale deeply, and your nostrils flare, not with anticipation of a warm meal, but with a subtle of something acrid, something stale. It's the smell of desperation, of survival etched into the very air of the camp. But amidst a sprawling, temporary city of canvas and mud, to human ambition and divine fervor, the year is 1101, and you are somewhere in Anatolia, the vast scape stretching out around you like a muted tapestry of ochre and dust. The sun, a relentless eye in a pale sky, on your shoulders, making the rough wool of your tunic cling uncomfortably to your skin. Day by day, you learn that the romantic notion of a crusader's life, painted in vibrant hues of chivalry and divine purpose, dissolves into the gritty reality of hunger. The provisions, painstakingly gathered and loaded onto wagons, were meant to sustain you. The sheer distance, the unpredictable nature of supply lines, threat of skirmishes meant that sustenance was a fluid concept. You wake up not to the clatter of a well-stocked larder, but to the gnawing emptiness in your belly, persistent ache that no amount of prayer seems to alleviate. Your hands rough and calloused from wielding a sword now fumble with meagre offerings. You observe your fellow travelers etch with a wariness that goes beyond mere physical exertion. their eyes once bright with the fire of conviction, dull resignation. You see a man, a seasoned warrior named Gulom, his beard matted with sweat and grime, sifting through a handful of dried peas. He's trying to pick out the pebbles, the bits of straw, anything that isn't edible. And he drinks sparingly from a water skin, the water tasting vaguely of leather and stagnant earth. Another day, the treasure hunt, Thomas. He rasps, offering you a wry smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes. You nod, your own throat dry. Cooked will swell into a bland, starchy gruel, often gritty with residual sand. A far cry from the roasted meats and fresh bread you might have imagined. The food, when it arrives, rarely what you'd call a feast. It's survival, for the most part. It's a monotonous cycle of grain-based staples hardtack, baked to last for months, so hard it often had to be softened in water or broth before you could chew it. And even then, it was like gnawing on a piece of wood. Then there's a barley often boiled into a thick, unappetizing porridge. Sometimes, if you're lucky, foraging party has been successful, you might get some wild greens, bitter and stringy, or perhaps a small portion of dried meat, and leathery, tasting faintly of the salt used for preservation. You recall a conversation you had with a merchant, Brother Bartholomew, a man who travelled with the army to secure supplies. He sat on an upturned barrel, his usually cheerful face drawn. The cost. He'd sighed, wiping his brow with a stained handkerchief. The cost of everything is astronomical. And the quality, well, he gestured vaguely towards the distant wagons. We'll buy what we can when we can. But the spoilage, the theft, the sheer inefficiency, it's a miracle we have anything at all. He'd confided that much of the grain was already infested with weevils, edible protein sources, perhaps, but hardly appetizing. Day by day, you learn that the act of eating itself becomes a chore, a necessity devoid of pleasure. You sit on the damp ground, the chill seeping through your thin breeches, eat your portion of gruel or hardtack with a wooden spoon, its surface smoothed by countless meals. The taste is bland, sometimes sour, sometimes metallic, depending on what the grain was stored in or how the water was treated. You watch a young boy, no older than 14, his face pale and gaunt, struggling to chew a piece of hardtack. He coughs a dry, hacking sound, and his eyes water. A pang of sympathy, a shared understanding of this gnawing discomfort. The communal aspect of eating, portrayed as a time of camaraderie, is here a stark reminder of your shared hardship. You huddle around small fires, smoke stinging your eyes, the meager portions laid out on rough cloths. Conversations are hushed, punctuated by the sounds of chewing. Occasional grunt of dissatisfaction. You overhear a grizzled soldier complaining to his companion, "Boot for a ripe apple, just one ripe juicy apple. This is not food, this is fuel." The comparison to modern day fast food, with its processed, often bland but readily available sustenance, is absurdly luxurious. Here, readily available is a gamble and sustenance is a constant struggle. You discover in archives, through faded monastic chronicles and fragmented military reports, that he and desperation that went into feeding these vast armies. The logistical nightmares are staggering. Imagine transporting thousands of tons of grain, salted meat, and wine across hundreds, even thousands of miles through hostile territory, refrigeration, no modern preservation techniques, and relying entirely on animal power and human labor. Spoilage rates were immense. Rats and insects were constant companions to the provisions, and when a caravan was attacked, struck the animals, the impact on the army's morale and physical strength was devastating. you see a group of pilgrims, fervor still evident, but their bodies weakened by hunger, sharing a single small loaf of bread into tiny pieces, each crumb a precious commodity. You feel a profound sense of their vulnerability, dependence on whatever meager provisions they can secure. The reality of their suffering is visceral, the absence of comfort. It's the absence of basic sustenance, the slow, insidious erosion of strength and spirit. This isn't a glorious adventure, it's a testament to endurance in the face of profound physical deprivation. As the sun begins its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the encampment, if you feel the familiar gnawing in your stomach intensify, you look at the meager portion of barley stew before you, a greyish, that offers little in the way of comfort or satisfaction. You know that tomorrow the struggle will begin anew. Feast continues, a daily ritual of survival that offers little respite and even less hope of true nourishment. The reality of Crusader life, as you're beginning to understand, was far removed from the epic tales. The physical toll of hunger, thirst, disease was immense, a constant battle fought on a battlefield of the body. This struggle for sustenance, this pervasive scarcity, crucial, often overlooked element in understanding why these campaigns were so brutal, so costly, and so often ended in failure. The stars begin to prick the darkening sky. You wonder what tomorrow's rations will bring, if your strength will be enough to face it. The next stage of this journey will delve deeper into the specific dietary challenges and the often unpleasant realities of what these warriors were forced to consume. A truly horrifying glimpse into the foundations of their grand endeavor. Sometimes I wonder what it would feel like to truly experience life in this distant time, to taste the dust of the road, gnawing ache of hunger as a constant companion. You wake up not to the gentle alarm of a digital clock, persistent chill of a damp stone floor seeping through your thin blanket, the faint smell of unwashed bodies and straw filling your nostrils. The dawn, when it finally breaks through the narrow window of your makeshift shelter, vibrant spectacle, but a grudging grey light that reveals the stark reality of your surroundings. And you discover that the romanticized notions of feasting and plentiful tables, so often conjured by tales of medieval life, illusion for the vast majority. Your journey, if you are one of the countless souls caught in the vast, churning machinery of the Crusades, is a constant battle against the very sustenance that is meant to fuel it, of the pre-modern world, especially when stretched across continents and subjected to the whims of war and arduous travel. Precarious and often empty place. The weeks pass and you discover the brutal arithmetic of preservation. Imagine, if you will, without refrigeration, no humming compressors, no frosty glass doors. When the harvest was gathered, whether it was grain, dried peas, was simple, make it last. But last was a relative term. For grains, storing them in cool, dry conditions was paramount. Yet even then, the ever-present threat of weevils and rats was a constant concern. A sack of wheat, meant to sustain a family for a winter, could be rendered inedible by a single infestation, its precious kernels riddled with tiny holes. The dust of their passage. The weeks pass, and you discover the limitations of salting and smoking. Kings of preservation, yes, but even their reign was fraught with peril. Salt was a precious commodity, expensive and later intensive to produce. The process of salting meat required vast quantities, and even then, the salt wasn't perfectly distributed, or if the meat wasn't kept sufficiently cool, spoilage could set in. To receive a slab of salted pork, its flesh a deep, unappealing red, the smell pungent, and sharp. This could turn, developing a slimy sheen and a sour odor, a silent warning of the putridity within. Smoking, similarly, protection, but it was a slow, smoky process that demanded constant tending of fires. The resulting meat, while preserved, had a bitter, acrid taste that could be difficult to stomach, a far cry from the rich we associate with modern cured meat. The weeks pass and you discover the tyranny of distance and the fragility of transport. Marching on crusade, the logistics were a nightmare. Armies were not self-sufficient units, parasitic organisms that devoured whatever lay in their path. When you moved slowly, beast across landscapes that offered little sustenance. Wagons pulled by wary oxen or horses, primary mode of transport for any preserved goods. But these wagons were slow, prone to breaking down, and vulnerable to attack. A sudden downpour could turn the roads into impassable quagmires, trapping your precious supplies. A raid by opportunistic bandits could leave you with nothing. The weeks pass and you discover the reality of the common soldier's diet, a lack thereof. While nobles might have had access to better, preserved foods, even they were not immune to scarcity. The diet was often a meager rotation of hardtack, a dense biscuit that was famously difficult to chew and prone to harboring weevils, and whatever could be scavenged. Imagine trying for days under a scorching sun, your armor heavy, your throat parched, a handful of these rock hard biscuits and perhaps a bit of dried stringy meat that taste like chalk and despair. A farmer's field ripe with grain, and know that it was meant for the local population, but on campaign became a tempting target. However, even when grain was acquired, it had to be milled. Without proper milling equipment, you were often left with coarse, gritty flour that made your bread even more unpalatable. In the archives of a monastery near Antioch, accounts detailing the provisioning of a small contingent of knights in the early 12th century. The entries spoke of salt pork, spoiled, lentils 2 sacks infested, and hardtack lasted but a fortnight. One particularly poignant entry mentioned the desperate purchase of a single sheep, slaughtered and consumed on the spot, for the men were weak with hunger. This wasn't a tale of abundance, it was a ledger of scarcity, a stark testament to the constant struggle for survival. The weeks pass and you discover the visceral impact of spoiled food, sharing a communal pot. The smell of boiled grains and whatever meager vegetables could be found filling the air. Suddenly, someone cries out, their face contorted in disgust. A patch of mold, a sickly green bloom on a piece of turnip, has been discovered. Pot might be discarded, a day's meager rations lost, or worse, the mold might go unnoticed, not too bad by a desperate cook. The ensuing sickness, the stomach cramps, the vomiting, the fever was a common affliction, often mistaken for battlefield wounds or divine displeasure. To be suspicious of anything that smells too strong, too sweet, or too off, you learn to eat slowly, each morsel with trepidation, hoping it won't be the one that turns your stomach inside out. Pass and you discover the stark contrast between the idealized image of medieval life and the harsh reality of its sustenance. While a lord might enjoy a roast fowl or a stew made with fresh herbs, for the vast majority, especially those on the move, was a monotonous, often insufficient, and frequently dangerous affair. The very act of eating, granted as a source of pleasure and energy, was a constant gamble, one's resilience against the relentless forces of decay and distance. This understanding, visceral grasp of the limitations of their larder, is crucial. It explains of why the soldiers on crusade were so prone to disease. Starvation was as great an enemy as any Saracen blade, and then why the simple act of finding safe, edible food was a daily, existential struggle. The weeks pass, and you realize that this struggle for sustenance was not confined to the battlefield. Back to everyday life, a constant hum of anxiety beneath the surface of society. Even in seemingly stable settlements, a bad harvest, a harsh winter, or the outbreak of a localized plague could decimate food supplies, communities teetering on the brink of starvation. This profound vulnerability, this constant dance with hunger, truth of the pre-modern world, and it casts a long shadow over the grand narratives of kings and battles. Pass and you begin to understand the sheer, unadulterated relief that a truly successful preservation effort would bring. The sheer terror of its failure. You prepare yourself as the chill of the evening deepens and the meager fire crackles. The next stage of our journey. Explore how this fundamental struggle for food directly impacted the health and morale of those undertaking these epic, horrific endeavors. In the quiet of your room, let's step into a world where silence had different meanings. Sense of sound could be a prelude to a feast or a testament to an empty belly. You've already glimpsed the vastness of the journey, the immediate sensory assault of the road, and the gnawing uncertainty of preservation. Let the silence settle and focus on the stark chasm that separated the tables of the privileged from the meager rations of the common soldier. As a fly on the wall, a silent observer privy to the most intimate details of life and death on the march. The air, thick with the dust of countless feet, and the unspoken anxieties of men far from home, carries with it the faint aroma of privilege, a scent that will only serve to sharpen the pang of your own hunger. Merely walking in their footsteps, you are feeling the emptiness in your own stomach, a visceral connection to the past that no amount of dry academic prose could ever convey. This is not a tale of glorious battles alone, but the elemental struggle for sustenance, a struggle that defined the very fabric of existence for those who answered the call to arms in the name of faith. Silence you experience now, the quiet comfort of your surroundings, is a stark contrast to the ever-present rumble of hunger that echoed through the Crusader camps, a constant, greyed hum of discontent that would eventually rise to a roar. The routine becomes familiar as you observe the stark contrast in provisions, while the nobility, the lords and ladies, merchants who financed these ventures, indulged in a veritable symphony of flavors. The common soldier's diet was a monotonous, insufficient affair. Picture the tent of Duke Godfrey of Bouillon, a sprawling edifice of richly dyed canvas, draped with tapestries depicting scenes of piety and conquest. Here, the air is thick with the cloying sweetness of spiced wine, savory aroma of roasted boar, its skin crackling and golden, and the earthy scent of freshly baked bread, a luxury unimaginable to many. Piled high with game birds, their plumage still hinting at their former vibrancy, alongside succulent cuts of venison, saffron and other precious spices imported from the east at great cost. There would be bowls of stew and root vegetables thickened with barley and flavored with herbs like sage and parsley, fruits, perhaps figs and dates, a sweet counterpoint to the savory dishes, the clinking of silver goblets, the murmur of satisfied conversation, of abundance. It painted a picture of a world apart, a reality built on the backs of those who received far, far less. Discovered in archives detailed provisioning lists for noble retinues that read like a king's banquet, the practical needs of sustenance and bordering on pure indulgence. Now, shift your gaze, your senses, to the sprawling, less organized encampments of the common soldiery. The air here is different. It's tinged with the acrid smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, present smoke from major fires. The sound is not of contented murmurs, but of the gnawing of teeth, the occasional cough, guttural rumbling of empty stomachs. Their sustenance, if one could call it that, was often limited to hardtack, a dense biscuit designed for longevity, but notoriously difficult to digest, described as tasting like old leather. Imagine trying to soften it by soaking it in water, a process that could take hours. The gritty texture remained a constant reminder of its utilitarian purpose. Alongside this might be a meager portion of salted or dried meat, often tough and stringy, or perhaps some peas or beans boiled into a bland gruel. The taste would be overwhelmingly salty, a desperate attempt to preserve what little they had, the inherent flavor of overcooked legumes. There were no spices, no variety, no comfort. Consider a conversation you might overhear. A grizzled sergeant, his face etched with the hardships of the march, speaks to a young recruit, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "See that lad?" The sergeant rasps, gesturing with a calloused thumb towards the distant, more opulent tents. "That's where the lords feast. They'll be drinking wine that'll make your head spin and eating meats so tender." The bon recruit, his own stomach giving a pathetic lurch, swallows hard. "And us, Sergeant?" The sergeant lets out a humorless chuckle, the sound like stones grinding together. "Us? We'll have our bread, and maybe a bit of boiled grain. Don't expect any songbirds on your plate, boy. This ain't a pilgrimage for pleasure. This is a trial." He spits on the ground. "Remember this, lad. The further you are from God's grace, the closer you are to His mercy. Ain't always found in a full belly." This stark disparity wasn't merely a matter of comfort, a matter of survival and morale. The nobles, well fed and energized, could endure the rigors of the campaign with greater resilience. Common soldier, however, weakened by malnutrition, became susceptible to disease, fatigue, and despair. Read accounts from the First Crusade and Ton 96 and Ton 99 that detail instances where sore soldiers resorted to eating their own horses, worse, their fallen comrades, out of sheer desperation. It's a chilling testament to how quickly the veneer of civilization could crack when the most basic human need went unmet. This hunger wasn't just a physical ailment, it was a psychological weapon, sowing seeds of resentment that would bloom into mutiny and desertion. Becomes familiar as you witness the subtle, yet profound, impact this inequality had on the collective spirit of the army. While the nobles often led from the front, their physical strength, bolstered by regular, nutritious meals, allowed them to fight with vigor. The common soldier, however, often found themselves lagging, their energy sapped, their minds clouded by the constant ache of hunger. This wasn't just about different calorie counts, it was about the fundamental difference in the human experience. For the nobility, the crusade was an adventure, a quest for glory and divine favor, a journey punctuated by moments of luxurious respite. The common foot soldier, it was a brutal test of endurance, a daily battle against starvation as much as against the enemy. Frustration, the simmering anger of seeing such opulence while your own body betrayed you with weakness, entirely alien even today when we witness vast wealth disparity. Systems are vastly more complex and capable of feeding billions. The principle of unequal access, stark contrast between abundance and scarcity, remains a potent force in shaping human societies. As the days blur into weeks, harsh realities of the march continue. you begin to understand the silent hunger that was the constant companion of the common soldier. The memory of those rich, spiced dishes, those succulent roasted meats, to highlight the stark emptiness of their own bowls. This wasn't just a matter of inconvenience, a fundamental erosion of their will, their strength, and their very humanity. The promise of heavenly reward felt a distant, almost mocking echo when the immediate earthly need for sustenance went unmet. The silence you feel now is a fleeting luxury, peace before we delve deeper into the consequences of this profound inequality, exploring how this pervasive hunger would shape the very course of these holy wars, what desperate measures men would take when their bellies were empty and their faith was tested. Primary sources reveal details that will change how you see this entire period. You've been lulled into a false sense of security, tales of chivalry and divine purpose, but as you delve deeper, the stark reality of sustenance, vos laik of it, begins to gnaw at you, much like it did for those who embarked on these ambitious journeys. Imagine the crisp, autumn air of Europe in the late 11th century, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filling your nostrils. On the outskirts of a village near Clermont, France, the year is 1095. The harvest has been gathered, and the granaries, overflowing, offer a reasonable promise of sustenance for the coming winter. Understanding deepens as we examine the European tree. For the common folk, life revolved around a predictable cycle of grains. The staple for the wealthy, baked into fine white bread, its aroma a testament to prosperity. For the vast majority, however, barley and oats, these were ground into coarse flour, often with the bran and germs still intact, creating a dark, the backbone of their diet. You can almost feel the rough texture of it between your teeth. Taste the earthy. Porridge, or pottage, was another ubiquitous dish, a thick, simmering stew of grains, vegetables like cabbage, leeks, onions, and whatever else could be scavenged from the fields or gardens. The smell of these bubbling cauldrons, hung over a central hearth, would have been a constant presence in every peasant dwelling. Meat was a luxury. Feast days, or after a successful hunt, pork was common, as pigs could forage for themselves. Poultry, chickens and geese were kept for eggs and occasional meat. Beef and mutton were less frequent, and sheep were valuable for their milk, wool and hides. Dried or salted fish was a vital source of protein, and in coastal regions, the preservation methods you learned about in Part 4 are critical here. Salting, smoking, drying were the only ways to keep food from spoiling, and the effectiveness of these methods directly impacted the quality and availability of provisions. Imagine the pungent, cured bacon or ham, the smoky residue clinging to dried fish. Your understanding deepens as we shift our gaze to the Holy Land, ancient traditions and a very different agricultural landscape. In the regions that would become the Crusader states, diet was heavily influenced by the Mediterranean climate. Olive oil was the primary fat used for cooking, dressing food. Fresh fruits like figs, dates, grapes, and pomegranates were abundant in season. Contrast to the often bland staples, vegetables included pulses such as lentils, chickpeas, and beans, which provided essential protein fiber. Grain cultivation was also significant, with wheat and barley being grown in less predictable yields than in the fertile plains of Europe. The locals relied on dairy products like cheese and yogurt, often made from sheep and goat milk. Spices were more readily available here than in much of Europe, with cinnamon, cumin, coriander flavor to dishes. Imagine the vibrant colors and aromas of a bustling market in Antioch or Jerusalem, with the scent of roasting meats, freshly baked flatbreads, and the exotic perfume of spices. Merchants hawking bundles of dried herbs, strings of dried figs, and amphorae filled with rich olive oil. It would be different too, with flat, roofed houses designed to capture cooling breezes, courtyards where families would gather to eat. Now, let's introduce two figures to illustrate the stark contrast. You see Brother Thomas, a humble monk from a French monastery, his rough spun tunic smelling faintly of incense and damp wool. He's clutching a small sack of dried peas and a chunk of hard, dark bread. He's been tasked with accompanying a small contingent of pilgrims, and his meager provisions are all he has. He speaks in hushed to a grizzled merchant, a man named Yusuf, whose stall overflows with plump dates and glistening olives. Yusuf, his face weathered by the sun, gestures to a basket of freshly baked bread, its aroma a tantalizing promise. Thomas. Yusuf's voice is a low rumble, tinged with a dialect you're still deciphering. You look thin. Have another loaf. The finest morning wheat ground this morning. The Thomas shakes his head, his eyes fixed on the meager peas in his sack. Good Yusuf, but my vows and my purse is light. These peas have sustained me thus far, and the Lord provides. He pauses, barely a whisper, though I confess the taste of fresh bread, it is a memory I cherish. Yusuf chuckles, warm rumbling sound. Memories do not fill the belly, brother, but perhaps a few dates, sweetness to ward off the dust of the road. He offers a handful of glistening, amber-colored fruits. Thomas accepts them with gratitude, the sugary burst a welcome, albeit temporary, relief. Understanding deepens as you realize the fundamental disconnect. The Crusaders, particularly the initial waves, expecting to find a land teeming with the bounty they were accustomed to, a readily available supply that could be easily procured, visioned a world where food was as readily available as in their European homelands, perhaps even more so, ported richness of the East. They were not prepared for the logistical nightmares of transporting food over vast distances. The fact that the local populations, while having their own food sources, were not necessarily geared towards supplying a massive, the concept of a centralized global pantry, as we understand it today with efficient supply chains, was utterly alien. Sophisticated agricultural practices of the Byzantine Empire or the Fatimid Caliphate were focused on regional needs, provisioning foreign armies. This sets the stage, a stark tableau of what should have been available versus the grim reality that would soon unfold. Foundation of their ability to march, to fight, to survive, rested on a food supply that was, at best, precarious. Abundance of Europe, relative to the harshness of campaigning, was a dangerous illusion. Perceived abundance of the Holy Land was a complex tapestry of local sustenance, not a ready-made buffet for invaders. You can almost feel the grit of the road under your feet, the warmth of the sun on your face, emptiness in your stomach. Tomorrow, we will explore how these initial expectations began to crumble. The first true signs of hunger began to assert their grim dominion. You've seen the movies, read the books. The lived reality was something else entirely. Imagine, if you will, the dawn breaking not with the gentle chirping of birds, with the guttural coughs of men already weary. You're not in a comfortable bed, you're on the hard, packed earth, chill seeping through your rough woolen tunic. The air, acrid tang of unwashed bodies, and the lingering smoke from last night's meager fires presses in. Your stomach, hollow cavern, rumbles with a persistent, gnawing ache that has become your constant companion. Beginning of the march of starvation, a grim reality that began the moment the glittering banners of the First Crusade. Such fervent hope in 1096 began to recede from the familiar landscapes of Western Europe. The initial enthusiasm, prayers, the promises of heavenly reward, they all felt potent as you left behind the familiar scent of wood smoke from your village hearth, fresh bread still lingering on your tongue. But the journey, even in these early days, was a brutal teacher. Packed provisions, the salted meats and dried grains seemed an inexhaustible bounty at first. You'd envisioned feasting, perhaps even a little merriment on the road. Instead, the sheer scale of the undertaking, the vast distances to be covered on foot, exert their relentless pressure. Each step was a drain, each mile a testament to the inadequacy of what you carried. Hard as stone, required considerable effort to gnaw through, and the salted meat, while preserving, rancid by the third week. You recall the hushed conversations amongst the soldiery, glances exchanged over dwindling rations. Brother Thomas, whose usual jovial demeanor had been replaced by a gaunt anxiety, confessed in a low whisper one evening, faintly of stale wine and desperation, "My son, I fear our faith alone will not fill these bellies. God provides, yes, to carry our own burdens, and our burdens are growing lighter far too quickly." The initial march from the Rhineland towards the Danube and then through the Balkans, brutal testament to the logistical nightmares that plagued such massive undertakings. You remember the sheer weight of your own pack, a rough, spun sack containing your meager belongings, a waterskin, and your share of the communal food. It chafed your shoulders raw, but the coarse wool a constant irritant against your skin. Your worn leather boots was uneven, sometimes muddy and slick, other times stony and unforgiving into one another, marked not by the sun's arc but by the increasing emptiness of your stomach. You learned to ration, concept alien to your previous life where food, though sometimes scarce in winter, was generally available. Now, a handful of dried peas, of hard cheese, became a precious commodity to be savoured, chewed slowly, trying to extract every last morsel of sustenance. Of the forests, the rolling hills dotted with wildflowers were beautiful, yes, was overshadowed by the gnawing hunger that made even the sweetest berry a fleeting, insufficient pleasure. You saw men, strong knights in their mail, their faces etched with a wariness that went beyond physical exertion, crust of bread with a grim camaraderie. Sir Caline, a veteran of skirmishes in the north, bright surcoat now stained and torn, shared a grim joke with you. By the saints, finest sword for a single roasted chicken right now. This dried biscuit tastes like dust from the tomb. His eyes, however, only a deep-seated concern that mirrored your own. Slowly but surely, of the situation began to dawn on even the most optimistic. The initial enthusiasm that God's favor would miraculously sustain them started to wane as the first few weeks turned into a month. Curated supplies, meant to last for a considerable journey, were being depleted at an alarming rate. Mouths to feed, thousands upon thousands of men, women, and even children following the armies, able strain on the provisions. You witnessed the desperation firsthand. A farmer, his face a mask of hunger and fear, tried to barter his worn cloak for a handful of grain from a passing wagon, his pleas falling on deaf ears as the wagon master refused. The smell of roasting meat, a distant memory now, was replaced by the ever-present aroma of wood smoke and the faint, scent of sickness. I discovered in my research that even in these early stages, before the true horrors of the East, proper sanitation and the reliance on contaminated water sources began to take their toll. Dysentery Reaper in its own right stalked the encampments, weakening men and further depleting their already meager strength. Optimism, the belief that they were marching towards a glorious victory, systematically eroded by the gnawing emptiness in their bellies and the growing realization that their journey was, in essence, a march of starvation. You remember the conversations, hushed and worried, as the sun dipped below the horizon, sky in hues of orange and purple that seemed to mock their plight. The communal fires, once bright with the spirit of fellowship, with a subdued glow illuminating gaunt faces and hollow eyes. The shared meals, once a source of comfort, nizingly small portions, each bite meticulously counted. You heard whispers of desertion, of men considering turning back. Shame and the fear of divine retribution kept most tethered to the path. The sheer effort of walking, day after day, armor and meager supplies, was a constant drain. Your muscles ached, your feet were blistered and raw. The gnawing hunger made every thought a struggle. You would lie awake at night, the rough ground digging into your back, listening to the sounds of the camp, the restless shuffling of feet, the occasional cough, the low murmur of prayers for sustenance. Stark contrast to the plentiful tables and readily available food of your homeland, a homeland that now felt like a distant, forgotten dream. This was the harsh awakening, the brutal introduction to the reality of the Crusades. Formidable enemy was not the infidel, but the gnawing emptiness within. Initial stages of the march were not a glorious procession, but a desperate struggle against the very basics of survival, a struggle that was already being lost. The coming days would only amplify this brutal truth, pushing them ever closer to the edge of endurance. We're going to experience history, not from textbooks, but from the inside reality of what the common soldier ate on the long, arduous journey to the Holy Land. Is a story that will haunt your dreams. Fantasized images of feasts and hearty camaraderie, the truth is far more grim, a testament to endurance rather than enjoyment. We've already touched upon the stark contrast between the tables of the nobility and the meager provisions of those who followed, if into the very substance of their sustenance, or rather, the lack thereof. The primary sources reveal details that will change how you see this entire period, painting a picture of hunger as a constant companion, a gnawing ache that never truly subsided. You've seen the movies, read the books, but the lived reality was something else entirely, testament to the sheer, unadulterated misery of their daily bread, if you could even call it that. Changes as the initial fervor of departure fades, replaced by the relentless monotony of the march. Majority of Crusaders, the concept of a meal was a foreign, almost mythical notion, dictated by what could be preserved, what was cheap, and what could be carried for months, even years, without spoiling. Beauty king of these provisions was hardtack, a substance so notorious that its very mention conjures images of desperation. But not the kind you'd find at a bakery today. This was a dense, unleavened brick, typically made from flour, water, till it was as hard as a stone. Its sole purpose was longevity. It was designed to withstand the rigors of travel, runt and rot, and it succeeded, albeit at a terrible cost to the consumer. You wake up to the familiar dry rasp in your throat, the taste of dust and stale air clinging to your tongue, the morning light, weak and filtered through the canvas of your tent, meager contents of your satchel. There it is, your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner. A few pieces of hardtack. It feels heavy, unforgiving in your palm. The texture is rough, almost abrasive. Bringing it to your lips feel the dryness, the way it promises to absorb every last drop of moisture from your mouth. You attempt to bite into it. Your teeth meet resistance, a solid, unyielding mass. You try again, bracing yourself. A small chip breaks off, sharp and jagged. The taste is bland, almost earthy, with a faint hint of soreness that hints at its age. It's not food as you know it, it's fuel, and not even pleasant fuel. To make it remotely palatable, you'd have to employ drastic measures. Some would try soaking it in water, but even then, it would only soften slightly, becoming a gummy paste. Others, in a desperate attempt to inject some flavor, might dip it in salted water to enhance its inherent dryness and saltiness. Imagine the scene: a group of weary soldiers huddled around a meager fire on these unyielding discs, their faces grim, their spirits as dry and brittle as their rations. The sound of their teeth grinding against the hardtack would be a constant, melancholic soundtrack to their journey. But hardtack wasn't the only challenge. The provisions carried by the common soldier were often a lottery, and usually a losing one. Alongside the hardtack, there might be some dried or salted meat if they were fortunate. This meat, often beef or pork, was preserved through salting, a process that rendered it incredibly tough and intensely salty. The smell alone could be overpowering, acrid aroma that permeated everything. When you bit into it, it was like chewing on leather, requiring immense effort to break down. The salt content was so high that it would leave your mouth parched, exacerbating the thirst that was already a constant affliction. Then there were the occasional additions, procured through foraging or meager trade: wild roots, edible plants, whatever could be found along the roadside. These were unreliable, and often the available flora was unfamiliar and potentially poisonous. Choice could lead to agonizing stomach cramps, fever, and even death, a terrifying gamble for a hungry man. Also paramount, and often tragically neglected, food storage was rudimentary at best. Sacks and barrels were exposed to the elements, to vermin, to the general filth of camp life. You've seen the images of soldiers in their tents, the ground beneath them damp and muddy. Imagine the state of their food stores. Weevils, grubs were an almost inevitable infestation in the hardtack. Soldiers would often inspect their biscuits by knocking them against their helmets or shields, the unwelcome inhabitants. But even then, many would simply eat them, a grim acceptance of the fact that protein, however unpleasant, was still protein. I discovered in archives a chilling account from a chronicler of the First Crusade, how soldiers would find maggots in their cheese and meat, and how even the water barrels were often teeming with life. One soldier, a man named Guillaume, wrote of his despair when discovering that his meager supply of dried figs had been entirely consumed by ants, behind only a fine dust. He described the gnawing hunger that followed, overshadowed even the constant ache of his blistered feet. The rhythm of life changes as the journey progresses. Just dwindle soldiers were expected to supplement their rations by foraging or purchasing food from local populations. This was often difficult. In hostile territories, foraging was dangerous, and the locals, often suspicious or impoverished themselves to spare, when they did find food, it was often of dubious quality. One common practice was to purchase victuals from opportunistic traders who followed the armies. These individuals, driven by profit, sell whatever they could acquire, often at inflated prices. The quality was rarely guaranteed. Buy a piece of bread that looked passable, only to discover it was mixed with sawdust or other fillers to increase its weight. A scene outside the walls of Antioch during the brutal siege of Tun 97, Tun 98. The army is starving. surrounding countryside has been stripped bare. You are part of a small group tasked with foraging, is sick with the stench of unwashed bodies, sickness, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Your stomach cramps with hunger. You come across a small, abandoned village. The houses are mostly empty, looted by earlier search parties. In one hovel, you find a sack, grunting, but your heart leaps. You tear it open, your hands trembling. Inside, there are a few shriveled blackened roots and a handful of dried peas, layer of dust, and what looks suspiciously like rodent droppings. Anything? Asks a gaunt-faced man beside you. You hold up the sack, the meager contents a stark reminder of your desperation. Not much, you reply, forcing a grimace. Mouthful maybe. He sighs, a sound that seems to carry the weight of the entire army's suffering. I suppose. Did you see any sign of? He trails off, unable to voice the unthinkable. You shake your head. Just dust and despair. This was the reality. The food was not just unappetizing, it was often a breeding ground for disease. Other stomach ailments were rampant, fueled by contaminated water and spoiled food. A soldier's strength could be sapped not by battle, but by a simple meal that turned his insides to water. The constant hunger, coupled with the poor nutrition, made them susceptible to every illness that swept through the crowded camps. To modern times is stark. We have supermarkets overflowing with choices, readily available clean water, regulations that, while not perfect, are light years ahead of anything these men could have imagined. Eating weevils or sawdust would be met with revulsion today, yet for the crusading soldier, it was a grim necessity. A testament to the sheer, unadulterated misery of their dietary existence. The rhythm of life changes as the sun begins to set. Long shadows across the encampment. You chew slowly on another piece of hardtack, the dryness, a familiar ache in your jaw. The taste thereof is a constant reminder of your vulnerability. Tomorrow will bring more of the same, more gnawing hunger, unyielding sustenance. But as you prepare to rest, a thought flickers. What of those who were truly desperate, but their own ingenuity to survive? That, my friends, is a story we will explore next. You've learned from period dramas that the truth is far more fascinating. You imagine a grand procession, banners snapping crisply in the wind, soldiers marching in disciplined ranks, their supply wagons rumbling along like well-oiled machines. But the reality of the Crusades, particularly as the journey wore on and the vast scapes of the East began to assert their will, was a starkly different and infinitely more grim tale. Reclaiming holy lands fueled by religious fervor and the promise of glory was quickly being eroded by the harsh of logistics. The very arteries of the Crusader armies, their supply lines, were riddled with blockages, ruptures, ultimately catastrophic failure. This isn't about heroic battles, it's about the gnawing emptiness in your stomach, search for sustenance, and the slow, agonizing realization that your survival hinges not on the strength of your sword arm, on the precarious arrival of a cart laden with grain. The initial optimism of the departure from Constantinople in the summer of 1096 began to curdle into a gnawing anxiety. Part of the First Crusade, a sprawling, unwieldy force comprised of tens of thousands of men, knights, foot soldiers, sergeants, motley crew of camp followers. The initial plan hatched in the gilded halls of Byzantine palaces and the bustling ports of Italy. Simple march overland through Anatolia to reach the Holy Land. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had promised provisions and safe passage, but these promises, the shimmering heat haze over the plains, proved to be ephemeral. The first cracks in the logistical dam appeared almost immediately. Sheer scale of the undertaking was unprecedented. Imagine trying to feed an army of, say, 50,000 people, plus their horses, traversing terrain that was often barren, hostile, and populated by populations who were, at best, indifferent, actively hostile. Your daily ration, if you were lucky, consisted of a few ounces of hardtack, a stale, hard biscuit made of flour and water, often riddled with weevils, and perhaps a meager portion of salted meat. The supply wagons had managed to keep pace. The taste was indescribable, a chalky, dusty flavor that clung to your tongue. Calories and calories were life. The supply chain itself was a fragile, multi-headed beast, a complex network of foraging parties, requisitioned goods from reluctant Byzantine towns, and the hope pre-arranged depots would be stocked and waiting. But what happened when those depots were empty? What happened when the foraging parties were ambushed or found nothing but withered scrub? What happened when the local populations, wary of an invading army, refused to sell their precious grain or livestock? These were not hypothetical questions, daily, soul-crushing reality. You remember speaking with Brother Thomas, Franciscan friar whose usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by a grim wariness. The grain wagons, he'd rasp, caius, dry and cracking, they were supposed to meet us at Nicomedia. We waited for 3 days, and all we saw was dust. The governor there claimed a blight, a pestilence on the wheat, but I saw his granaries, lad, full. He wanted payment in gold, promises from Byzantium. This was a common refrain. The Byzantines, while ostensibly allies, were also shrewd political players. They saw the Crusaders as a necessary, if somewhat unruly, force to reclaim their lost territories, about to bankrupt themselves doing so. The promised supplies often came with exorbitant prices, simply never materialized. The sheer difficulty of transporting food across vast distances in the 11th century cannot be overstated. There were no refrigerated tro-fast moving trains. Supplies were moved by ox-drawn wagons, breaking on rough terrain, or bypack animals whose endurance was limited and whose fodder also needed to be supplied. Single broken wheel could halt an entire convoy for days, while a stampede of oxen could scatter vital provisions to the winds. Distances involved were also a killer. Imagine the journey from Europe to Anatolia, rugged terrain of modern-day Turkey. The supply lines stretched for hundreds, even thousands of miles, each mile a potential point of failure. You recall seeing the soldiers' faces, gaunt and hollow-eyed, as they chewed on roots dug from the parched earth, the leather straps of their sandals in a desperate attempt to stave off the gnawing hunger pangs. The horses, the very engines of war, were suffering even more. Without adequate fodder, they grew weak, their ribs protruding like the bars of a cage. A cavalry charge, the pride of any knightly army, became a pathetic shuffle. The harrowing episode you witnessed involved a desperate attempt to forage for food in a seemingly deserted village. You, along with a few other soldiers, cautiously entered the cluster of stone and mud brick dwellings, with the smell of wood smoke and something else, something acrid and unpleasant. Inside one of the huts, a woman was huddled over a meager fire, stirring a pot of what looked like boiled weeds, her eyes sunken and fearful, fixed on you. "You?" asked, your voice hoarse. She shook her head slowly, her gaze dropping to the pot. "Thistle roots," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And these bitter greens. The soldiers, they took the grain. The sheep." You felt a pang of guilt, knowing that your own army further ahead, responsible for this devastation. It was a vicious cycle. The army needed food, so it took from the locals with nothing. thus exacerbating the problem for the next group of soldiers who passed through. Proper preservation methods also played a significant role. While salting and drying were employed, always effective, especially in the intense heat of the eastern summers, you'd seen barrels of salted meat turn rancid, low enough to turn your stomach. The grain, even when it arrived, was often damp and prone to mold, rendering it inedible or poisonous. The consequences of this logistical breakdown were devastating. Starvation wasn't just a discomfort, it was a slow, agonizing death that weakened the army from within. Soldiers became susceptible to disease, their immune systems ravaged by malnutrition. Sheer fervor of the crusade began to wane, replaced by a desperate struggle for survival. Ambition of conquering Jerusalem seemed a distant, almost laughable, when the immediate concern was finding a handful of edible berries to keep you alive for another day. Foundation of the Crusader enterprise, its ability to sustain itself, was crumbling, piece by agonizing piece. The soldiers to face the harsh realities of a broken promise and an empty stomach. Now that the true enemy wasn't always the Saracen warrior waiting on the horizon, often it was the empty wagon, the barren field, broken wheel, and the unfulfilled promise of provisions. The journey was a constant in the unforgiving realities of sustenance, a lesson etched into the hollows of your cheeks and the gnawing emptiness in your gut. As the sheer weight of these failures begins to settle upon you, a heavy cloak of despair, taste the dust of the unsupplied depots, feel the gnawing ache of an empty stomach. Stage of this arduous journey will test your resilience in ways you can barely comprehend, of human endurance and the very concept of survival. The further back we go, we realize how much courage ordinary life required. Just the grand pronouncements of kings or the fierce clang of swords that defined the past. It was the quiet struggle for survival, for a single day of relative peace. You've seen the movies, read the books. Reality was something else entirely, a tapestry woven with threads of hardship that we, in our modern comfort, can scarcely comprehend. Tonight, we're going to experience history not from textbooks, but from the inside and the reality of sustenance. Particularly during the tumultuous era of the Crusades, was a brutal, often deadly affair. Forget what you've learned from period dramas. The truth is far more fascinating and, frankly, far more horrifying. We touch the sheer inadequacy of the supply lines, the desperate measures taken to feed armies on the march, but now delve into the grim consequences of those failures, the pervasive, insidious sickness that stalked every camp, every city, wary traveler. The very sustenance you sought, the bread that was meant to fuel your journey, could become your executioner, becomes your teacher, and the lessons learned from contaminated food and water during the Crusades were etched in agony. A crusader, perhaps a simple peasant conscripted into the grand enterprise, or a seasoned soldier of fortune. 47. The Second Crusade. You are marching through Anatolia, a land of sun, baked plains and rugged mountains. From the familiar, albeit often meager, sustenance of your homeland, the initial enthusiasm, the fervent prayers have begun to wane, gnawing hunger and a growing unease. The carefully rationed biscuits, hard as stone and tasting vaguely of dust and desperation. Your water skin, once a reliable source of life, now holds a murky, lukewarm liquid that smells faintly of stagnant pond. You remember the day vividly. It was near the city of Dorelium, a place that would soon become synonymous with disaster for the French contingent led by Louis. The army had been on the move for days, the dust a constant companion, coating your throat and stinging your eyes. Your stomach rumbled, a hollow ache that no amount of dried fruit or tough meat could truly satisfy. You stopped at what appeared to be a small stream with wilting reeds. The water looked clear enough, a deceptive shimmer in the harsh sunlight. Your thirst was overwhelming, primal need that eclipsed caution. You knelt, cupped your hands, and drank deeply. The cool liquid a momentary balm. Beside you, a fellow soldier, a burly man named Gulam, with a beard perpetually matted with sweat and grime, did the same. From God, he grunted, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. You nodded, a faint smile touching your lips, of relief in the vast, unforgiving landscape. But that relief was short-lived. By nightfall, the first symptoms began to manifest: a low fever, a dull ache in your gut that intensified with each passing hour. Gulam was already worse, his face pale and clammy, his body racked with violent tremors. He lay on the hard ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. You tried to offer him comfort, a hand on his feverish brow registered your presence. The sickness, you soon discovered, was not confined to you and Gulam. Throughout the camp, chorus of moans and cries began to rise as the contaminated water, or perhaps the tainted provisions, took its toll. Knowledge of the time, while possessing its own unique understanding, equipped to combat the invisible enemy that had invaded your bodies. Physicians, more accustomed to treating battlefield wounds and humors, were baffled. They spoke of imbalances, of miasmas, of divine displeasure, were applied. Prayers were recited, but the relentless grip of dysentery, cholera, or typhoid fever, diseases born from the very water and food meant to sustain you, tightened its hold. I discovered in archives, through fragmented accounts of the Second Crusade, that the French army, in particular, suffered catastrophic losses due to such ailments. Odo of Duel, who accompanied the crusade, lamented the widespread sickness, noting how many men were incapacitated or fight. The stench of sickness, a cloying mixture of sweat, excrement, and decay, permeated the air, a constant reminder of your vulnerability. Experience becomes your teacher, and the lesson you learned that night was a brutal one. Was not always clad in armor and wielding a sword. It could be in the water you drank, the bread you ate, air you breathed in a poorly managed camp. You saw men strong and hale just days before, reduced to emaciated husks, bodies ravaged from the inside out. The sounds of retching and desperate cries became the soundtrack to your suffering, as comrades, their faces contorted in agony, begged for release, a glorious victory replaced by a desperate plea for an end to their pain. The communal latrines, hastily dug trenches, utter misery, overflowing with the sick and dying. The smell was overpowering, to the breakdown of basic sanitation. You remember a conversation with a seasoned veteran, a man named Thomas, face bore the scars of countless skirmishes. He sat by the dying embers of a fire, his eyes hollow. This is the true enemy, his voice weak. Not the Saracen, but the rot within. We carry death with us, in our bellies and in our waterskins. I've seen armies broken not by steel, but by the sickness that festers in their midst. He pointed, trembling finger towards a group of men huddled together, bodies trembling. That's the cost of a poorly managed march. Price of ignorance. The lack of proper food preservation techniques meant that even when supplies were available, spoiled quickly in the heat and damp, meat would fester, bread would mold, and fruits would rot. Waste generated by a large army, combined with inadequate disposal methods, created breeding grounds for disease. Seen a merchant attempting to sell what looked like perfectly good dried figs, discover later that they had been stored in a damp, rat-infested cellar, masking the insidious presence of harmful bacteria. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. Act of eating, a fundamental human need, became a gamble with fate. The irony was not lost on you. You had embarked on this journey with a fervent belief in a righteous cause, a desire to reclaim holy lands, but here you were, by the stench of disease, your own body weakening, your spirit tested, not by the enemy's might, microscopic invaders that feasted on your own flesh. The concept of hygiene, as we understand it today, was rudimentary at best. Before handling food was an alien concept. Water sources were often shared with livestock. Waste disposal was a haphazard affair. You might have witnessed a soldier carelessly discard their waste near a water source, oblivious to the chain reaction of sickness they were initiating. As the days bled into weeks, the army's strength dwindled. Battles fought, but from battles lost to unseen foes. The grand pronouncements of victory seemed hollow, echoes against the grim reality of suffering. You too felt the familiar pang of nausea, the growing weakness in your limbs. Ash seemed to be permanently lodged in your mouth, a phantom reminder of the sickness that stalked you. The dream of Jerusalem, beacon of hope, now felt like a cruel mirage obscured by the fog of illness. This, you realize with a chilling certainty, sucked in the Crusades. It was a constant, terrifying gamble, a potential harbinger of a swift and agonizing demise, far more common and insidious than any battlefield wound. The very act of sustenance was a perilous undertaking, a testament to the harsh realities faced by those who dared to journey to the Holy Land. Experience becomes your teacher. Now is one of profound gratitude for the advancements that allow us to eat without this constant, gnawing dread. Into the heart of medieval hardship is far from over. Next, confront the grim realities of disease beyond the contaminated diet, the plagues that swept through camps like wildfire, vibe armies into ghost towns. The weight of history settles gently on your shoulders as our story begins. You find yourself amidst the clamour and the stench of a makeshift encampment, the air thick with the earthy scent of unwashed bodies, and something far more insidious, the sickly sweet odour of decay. This isn't a grand banquet hall, it's a sprawling, to human endurance, or perhaps human folly. We are deep within the Second Crusade. The year is 1147. Armies of France and Germany are slowly, agonizingly, making their way towards the Holy Land. You, scribe tasked with documenting the realities of this grand and often grim undertaking, to witness firsthand why sustenance was less a comfort and more a constant, gnawing threat. Immediate surroundings are a chaotic symphony of sound, the dull thud of hammers on wood, shouts of men arguing over meagre rations, the incessant buzzing of flies, sound that will become as familiar to you as your own heartbeat. You can feel the grit of the earth under your worn leather boots. Damp chill seeps through your woolen tunic. Despite the flickering, smoky fire nearby, the fire meant for cooking, shadows on rough, hewn wooden crates and burlap sacks, revealing glimpses of what lies within. This is where the true horror of the Crusades diet begins to reveal, not in the taste of the food, but in its very preservation. Seasons change, so too does the nature of the provisions. In the early days, before the long march truly began, relatively fresh if monotonous, dried meats, hardtack biscuits, salted fish, grain formed the backbone of the diet. But the vast distances, the unpredictable weather, sheer scale of the armies meant that spoilage was not an exception, but an inevitability. Imagine, if you will, a sack of grain, left exposed to the damp air. Within days, a fine layer of mildew would bloom across its surface, invitation to the microscopic organisms that thrive in such conditions. The grain itself, once plump and nourishing, mealy and discolored, often harboring the telltale signs of rodent infestation, tiny droppings, the faint scent of their presence. You've seen it yourself in the dim light of a hastily erected tent, a rat darting from beneath a pile of discarded foodstuffs, its whiskers twitching, its eyes gleaming with an ancient hunger. Preparation areas are a testament to a profound lack of sanitation. Open fires are the primary means of cooking, built directly on the ground, spitting embers onto the very earth where food is being handled. There are no clean surfaces, no running water for washing hands or utensils. Imagine a butcher, his hands stained with the blood of a recently slaughtered sheep, calloused fingers to knead dough for biscuits. The meat, often butchered days in advance and exposed to the elements, a greenish hue, the fat turning rancid, its smell a pungent assault on your nostrils. The flies, by this irresistible perfume of decay, would swarm with a relentless tenacity, their iridescent bodies landing on every exposed surface, carrying unseen cargoes of disease. You can feel their tiny, tickling presence on your own skin, a constant reminder of the invisible world at play. Let me tell you a story I unearthed in the monastic archives of Clairvaux, penned by a disillusioned knight. He described with visceral detail the state of their provisions after just a few weeks on the road. Our bread, he wrote, as a crumbly, mouldy mass riddled with the tiny tunnels of worms. The meat we receive is frequently putrid, and the water we drink, drawn from stagnant pools, its own vile burden. He went on to describe a particular incident where a batch of salted pork, source of protein, was found to be so advanced in its decomposition that it attracted a veritable carpet of maggots. The sheer volume of insects was described as all living drowsy, their wriggling mass a horrifying spectacle. Taste the metallic tang of fear and disgust that must have filled his mouth as he penned those words. As the seasons change, as on preserved foods intensifies, and with it the dangers, salt was a precious commodity, and its judicious use was crucial for preservation. However, even well-salted provisions could succumb to the elements. Long journeys where the salt itself could leach out or become insufficient. Imagine a barrel of salted fish through the lean winter months. If the barrel wasn't perfectly sealed, or if the salt concentration wasn't high enough, the fish would begin to spoil from the inside out. The flesh would soften, the brine would become cloudy, characteristic odor of ammonia would begin to permeate the air. You can almost feel the clammy texture of such fish, the way it would cling to your fingers, the lingering unpleasant scent that no amount of scrubbing could truly erase. You were in conversation with a grizzled veteran, a man whose face was a roadmap of past campaigns. He spoke of how, particularly harsh winter, they were forced to eat grain that had been stored for years, its quality long since compromised. He rasped, his voice rough as sandpaper, like dirt and despair, and the sickness it brought, well, never saw the spring. He described how the grain, when ground into flour, would produce a dark, sticky paste, the remnants of mints of its original form, but also the husks of insects and the fine dust of rodent droppings. This flour would be heavy, dense, and often bitter, a far cry from the light, airy loaves you might imagine. It was sustenance, yes, but at a terrible cost, a slow poisoning that weakened the body and dulled the spirit. This, you realize, a stark contrast to our modern world, where best by dates and refrigeration are taken for granted, and foodborne illnesses are vastly different in scale and nature. the internal monologue of a young soldier, disconsolately at his meager ration of hardtack, echoes in your mind. "Another day, another rock," he muttered, barely a whisper. "I'd give anything for a fresh apple, piece of cheese that didn't smell like the devil's breath." His hands, calloused from wielding a sword, trembled slightly as he broke off a piece of the biscuit, scanning the surrounding camp for any sign of movement from the ever-present vermin. The hardtack itself, designed to be incredibly durable, was often so hard that it required soaking in liquid before it could be consumed, and even then, texture was like chewing on sawdust. Imagine the frustration, the sheer wariness of having to force down food that offered so little pleasure and so much potential peril. This constant exposure to spoiled food and the attendant infestations was a breeding ground for disease. Dysentery, typhus, debilitating illnesses were rampant, often incapacitating more men than the enemy's blades. You remember reading a passage from the Chronicle of William of Tyre, who documented the appalling conditions of the Crusader armies, putridity of the victuals, and the great mortality that ensued. It wasn't just the battlefield that claimed lives, it was the very sustenance that was meant to fuel them. The flies and rats were not merely nuisances, they were vectors of death, the invisible seeds of sickness from one soldier to another, from one camp to the next. As the sun begins its slow descent, wary shadows across the encampment, you can't help but feel a profound sense of empathy for these men. A journey of faith and conquest, facing external enemies, but also battling a constant internal enemy, very food that meant to sustain them. The grim feast was not a singular event, but a daily reality, testament to the harshness of life on the move in the 12th century. The smell of decay, the buzz of flies, the scuttling of rats, these were the constant companions of the Crusader, woven into the very fabric of their existence. Prepare to move further into this arduous journey. Remember that the fight for survival was often waged not with steel, with the simple yet perilous act of eating. The next stage of our journey will delve deeper into the ingenious and often desperate methods employed to combat these pervasive threats, and the surprising resilience of the human spirit in the face of such overwhelming adversity. Slows as we prepare to explore what life truly meant in another time. The familiar scent of your pillow fades, replaced by the acrid tang of wood smoke, and something less definable, something earthy and faintly metallic, no longer in your comfortable bed, but huddled beneath a rough, spun blanket, offering little defense against the damp chill of the pre-dawn air. The year is 1148, soldier in the Second Crusade, somewhere in the desolate Anatolian landscape, miles from any semblance of a secure encampment. The memory of a recent brutal ambush by Seljuk horsemen still clings to you like the grit on your skin. Carefully curated provisions that once filled your meager pack are now a distant, almost laughable memory. Pronouncements of piety and divine favor that spurred you from village in France seem a cruel mockery in this harsh reality. Genova, the persistent, hollow ache, a constant companion that has become more familiar than the faces of your fellow soldiers. The sky above is a bruised twilight, the stars beginning to dim as the first faint blush of dawn creeps over the jagged horizon. Silence is broken only by the rustling of dry scrub and the occasional nervous cough from a nearby comrade. Is the dawn of desperation. With each passing moment, the gnawing in your gut intensifies, reminder of the precariousness of your existence. The carefully planned supply lines, so vital for any sustained military campaign, dissolve like mist in the morning sun. Part 9 painted a grim picture of those catastrophic failures, living the stark, unvarnished truth of it, the vast distances, the hostile terrain. Relentless harassment by enemy patrols have rendered the flow of grain, salted meat, and even basic water agonizingly slow. All you remember the frustration, the growing fear as wagons laden with provisions were lost or captured, leaving you and thousands of others increasingly reliant on what little could be scavenged. The initial optimism, sermons, and the promise of holy plunder has long since been replaced by gnawing anxiety. The immediate reality is stark hunger, mild inconvenience. It's a physical torment. You've seen men grow gaunt, their ribs protruding like the bars of a cage, sunken and feverish. The vibrant hues of their tunics have faded, much like their strength, to muted, dusty shades. Your own hands tremble slightly as you reach for your empty water skin, the leather cracked and stiff. The taste of stale water, to find any, is a luxury. More often, it's the brackish, metallic tang of water from stagnant pools against dysentery, a foe as deadly as any Saracen blade. Part 10 detailed the horrific diseases that festered in these conditions, witnessed firsthand the debilitating effects of spoiled food and contaminated water. The memory of Brother Thomas, his face etched with exhaustion, trying to soothe the agonizing cramps of men struck down by flux, is a recurring nightmare. Now, the focus shifts to the desperate measures taken to survive. Foraging becomes a daily ritual, a grim hunt for sustenance. You've learned to identify the bitter roots of certain desert plants, their taste acrid and unpalatable. They fill the void. You watch with a mixture of envy and revulsion as others dig for grubs. Bodies, a protein source that your modern sensibilities would recoil from, but which here represents life itself. The smell of roasting grasshoppers, their chitinous exoskeletons crackling over tiny, carefully guarded fires, is a scent that now can evoke a pang of hunger rather than disgust. You recall a conversation with a grizzled veteran named Guillaume, scars and sun-baked wrinkles as you crouch by a Meja fire near the ruins of a long abandoned caravanserai, thick with the smell of dust and the faint sweetish odor of decay. See this. Guillaume rasped of dried berries, dark and shriveled, found these near that the thorny bush, taste like ash eating itself. He popped a few into his mouth, chewing slowly, his eyes scanning the surrounding scrubland with practiced vigilance. Remember, lad, anything that ain't poisonous is food. If it's barely poisonous, well, that's a risk some of us are willing to take. You nod, your own throat dry. Your stomach churns at the thought, but the gnawing ache is a powerful motivator. You've seen men eat the leather straps from their sandals, hours to soften them, the resulting broth thin and greasy, but still offering something, however meager. Desperation is a flavor that permeates everything. With each passing moment, the desperation deepens, self-scrutinizing every patch of ground, every scraggly bush, the once familiar landscape so alien to your European eyes, albeit a sparse and dangerous one. You remember a moment when you, along with a few other exhausted soldiers, stumbled upon a small herd of wild goats, their lean bodies surprisingly agile. The hunt was brutal and clumsy, for its scramble than a coordinated effort. The joy of finally bringing one down was quickly tempered by the raw, butchering it with crude knives, the metallic tang of fresh blood filling the air, mingling with the dry dust. The meat, finely roasted over a sputtering fire, was tough and stringy, gamey to an extreme, but it was sustenance, a victory against the encroaching void. You also recall the grim reality of scavenging from the fallen. After skirmishes, the battlefield became a macabre marketplace. The bodies of the fallen, Both friend and foe were stripped not only of weapons and armor, but desperate of any edible remnants. The thought is revolting, yet you know of men who, driven by starvation, stooped to such measures. The stench of death, the flies, the sheer indignity of it all was a price paid for a few more hours of life. You remember another conversation, this time with a young man named Pierre, his face pale and drawn, wide with a fear that went beyond the battlefield. You were sharing a meager handful of roasted roots by the dying embers of a fire, cool and still. I saw a man yesterday, Pierre whispered, his voice cracking. He was digging near the old Roman road, madman. Found a dead horse, bloated and festering in the sun. He shuddered, his hands clenching. He started to eat it, raw. You look at Pierre, your own stomach clenching. You've heard whispers, seen the haunted looks in men's eyes, the unhygienic conditions of food storage as detailed in Part 11, and even what little food was available was often contaminated. But this was beyond contamination, was a primal descent into survival. We're not men anymore, are we? Pierre continued, his voice barely audible. Just animals scrabbling for whatever we can find. You offer him a small dry root, a gesture of solidarity. Why endure? That's what we do. But even as you say it, the conviction wavers. The sheer horror of your situation is beginning to erode the very essence of what it means to be human. The Crusaders of faith and purpose were becoming hollowed out shells, driven by the most basic animalistic need to eat, to survive, no matter the cost. This isn't a romantic quest. It's a brutal struggle against the very forces of nature and desperation. You've learned through bitter experience that in this unforgiving land, eating was not a pleasure, but a constant, terrifying challenge. Own hunger, a dull ache now, serves as a constant, morbid reminder of this grim truth. With each passing moment, rays of the sun begin to warm the desolate landscape. You can feel the gnawing emptiness in your stomach, demanding attention. The memory of the meager roots you managed to find yesterday is a faint comfort, but the need for more is already asserting itself. Lessons of survival have been etched into your very being, shaping your perceptions and your actions. Stark reality of the Crusades, stripped of its religious fervor and battlefield glory, reveals itself as a brutal test of endurance. Fundamental human need to eat becomes the ultimate measure of a man's will to live. Pursuit of sustenance, the desperate measures taken to simply fill your belly, is the true core of this pilgrimage. As the sun climbs higher, casting long shadows across the barren earth, the day's foraging and scavenging must begin anew. The memory of the taste of desperation, a bitter and unforgettable flavor. The next chapter in your survival will undoubtedly bring more such encounters, more stark choices, further revelations about the resilience and the desperation of the human spirit when pushed to its absolute limits. Mine drift back to an age when the very concept of normal was radically different. Imagine the grit of dust coating your tongue, persistent ache in your belly, a constant companion through endless marches and desperate sieges. We've explored the scarcity, the sheer unappetizing nature of what little was available. But now we delve into the truly grim, strategies born of utter desperation. This is where we confront the unedible, the creatures and parts of creatures that would send shivers down a modern spine, yet were the soldiers of the Crusades a grim necessity for survival. Forget the romanticized images of feasting nights. Reality of hunger gnawing at the very soul. Gradually, you realize that the line between sustenance and revulsion was blurred by the relentless demands of the Holy Land. Part 10 touched upon the pervasive diseases, consequence of consuming food that had long passed its prime, often teeming with unseen horrors. Part 11 painted a stark picture of food storage, or rather the lack thereof, where rats and weevils were as common as grains of wheat, laid bare the desperate hunts, the futile searches for anything remotely edible in barren landscapes. Now, the ultimate fallback, the creatures and parts of creatures that modern sensibilities recoil from. In the parched plains outside Antioch, perhaps during the brutal siege of 1098, thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, festering wounds, and the ever-present metallic tang of dried blood. Stomach churns, not just with hunger, but with a gnawing dread. The carefully rationed supplies have long since vanished. Already scarce, has been hunted to near extinction by desperate armies on both sides. Your companions, their faces with hardship, huddle around meager fires, the flickering light casting long shadows that seem to mock their hunger. Anything, Brother Thomas, you ask, your voice raspy from thirst and disuse. Thomas, a stout Benedictine monk who had joined the pilgrimage, shakes his head, his usually rosy cheeks now sunken and pale. Foraging near the camp, his worn leather pouch surprisingly empty. Only roots, my son, and even those are scarce. Birds they are few and far between, and too swift for these wary limbs. Gradually, you realize that the whispers begin, then growing bolder as desperation mounts. It starts with the horses, not the prime steeds of the knights, but the old, the ones that succumbed to disease or injury. The thought of eating horse meat, entirely unheard of in times of extreme famine in Europe, was still a step many found difficult to take. Yet, smell of roasting meat, however unpalatable its origin, was a siren call. You see a group of hardened foot soldiers, grim and determined, hacking away at a horse carcass. The meat is tough, stringy, and carries a gamey taste that clings to the back of your throat. It's far from pleasant, but it's protein, it's fuel. Did you try it? A young squire, barely more than a boy, asks you, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Clutching a piece of dried bread, his only sustenance for the day. You nod slowly, the memory of the taste still vivid, pleasant, but it fills the void, and it is better than the alternative. The alternative you soon discover as the siege wore on and the situation grew more dire. The soldiers turned to creatures they would have previously recoiled from. I discovered in the Chronicles of Fulcher of Chartres, first crusade mentions of soldiers resorting to eating dogs, horses, camels, ots and serpents. The mention of serpents is particularly chilling. Imagine the fear, the sheer revulsion. These slithering creatures, their flesh offering a meager, potentially poisonous reward. You see a grizzled veteran, stained and dented, gnawing on what appears to be a dried, leathery strip. He catches your gaze and offers a wry, humorless smile. He rasps, his voice like grinding stones. Boiled for hours, then dried again. Tastes like old boot leather, substance. He offers you a piece, his calloused fingers stained dark. You politely decline, your stomach lurching. Yet you see others eagerly accepting, their hunger overriding their disgust. Then there are the scavengers, infest the besieged cities, scurrying through the rubble and the discarded refuse. These were not the plump rodents of a modern city. These were starved, diseased creatures, likely riddled with the very plagues that were decimating the ranks. Yet, in the darkest hours, even these were considered a potential source of sustenance. You witness a furtive exchange in the shadows of a ruined building, coins for a small, wrapped bundle. You don't want to know what's inside. The internal monologue is a constant battle, revulsion wars with the primal instinct to survive. You hear the whispers of your own body, the desperate plea for nourishment, riding the societal conditioning that tells you certain things are simply not food. You recall a passage from the Gesta de Francos, soldiers in Antioch eating their own horses and then their pack animals, the vermin of the earth. The vermin of the earth, a chillingly broad category. One evening, wind whips through the skeletal remains of a conquered village. You sit with a fellow pilgrim, farmer named Guillaume from Normandy. He's meticulously scraping the last vestiges of meat from a bird's bone, a small, its feathers long gone. My wife, she would faint if she saw this, Guillaume says, his voice low and melancholic, his eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire. We had chickens, fat ones, and pigs. We ate well at home, thankful for a bird this size. We all endure what we must. You reply, the words feeling hollow, own meager ration, a sliver of dried cheese, hard as stone, and a few shriveled dates. Feast compared to what others are consuming. You think of the abundance of your homeland, the overflowing markets, available, palatable food. It feels like a dream from another life. The sheer ingenuity born of desperation is also evident. You see soldiers meticulously cleaning the intestines of animals, boiling them repeatedly to remove any residual foulness, stuffing them with whatever scraps they could find. The concept of offal, of using every part of an animal, was a necessity. Tripe, liver, heart, these were not delicacies, but survival. Gradually, realize that the psychological toll of this constant struggle for sustenance, of being forced to consume what is inherently unappealing, it strips away civility, leaving behind a raw, animalistic drive. Camaraderie forged in battle is tested by the gnawing emptiness, the suspicion that others might be hoarding a hidden morsel. It's a world where your very humanity is challenged with every bite or lack thereof. As the night deepens, seeps into your bones, you reflect on the immense courage it took not just to face the enemy, but to face oneself, the deeply ingrained revulsion, and simply eat to live. This was the reality of the Crusades, far cry from the glorious pronouncements of faith and conquest. It was a brutal, visceral struggle for survival. Basic human need became a source of profound horror. This constant, gnawing hunger, measures taken to sate it, would continue to plague the Crusaders. Next stage of our journey will take us deeper into the consequences of these prolonged deprivations. Body and mind fared under such extreme duress, and the lasting impact it had on those who survived never quite capture the texture of daily life in this remarkable era. They speak of grand pronouncements, charges of the clash of steel and the fervor of faith, but they rarely whisper about the gnawing emptiness in your belly, the persistent ache that became a constant companion. You wake up not to the glorious fanfare of trumpets, but to the dull rumble of hunger. The air in your makeshift shelter, a collection of rough, spun wool blankets draped over scavenged branches, faint scent of damp earth, and something vaguely acrid. Your skin feels clammy, weave of your tunic scratching against a back that aches from sleeping on uneven ground. Sunlight, to pierce the oppressive canopy of trees, falls in dappled, weak shafts, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the still air. The sounds are muted, the distant bleating of a scrawny goat, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. the low murmur of wary voices from other encampments. It's a world stripped bare where the veneer of civilization has peeled away, leaving only the raw, desperate struggle for existence. When you consider the absolute scarcity of anything remotely palatable, the idealized image of feasting nights laden with roasted meats crumbles under the weight of reality. For most, the search for sustenance was a grim, perilous undertaking. The land, ravaged by armies and stripped bare by desperate populations, offered little. I'd identify the most common edible roots, their shapes and textures etched into your memory through bitter experience. Pale, fibrous roots of the burdock plant, surprisingly filling but requiring extensive, if boiling, to soften their toughness. Starchy tubers of wild yams, if you're lucky enough to find them, offer a more substantial meal, but their preparation is laborious, involving digging with bare, blistered hands until the soil itself feels like an extension of your own flesh. Seen men gnaw on the bark of certain trees, scraping away the outer layers to reach the softer cambium beneath. A desperate measure that offers little more than a fleeting sense of something to chew. Your mind, however, drawn to the plants that held a more sinister promise. You remember the hushed warnings, the furtive gestures whispered around dying campfires. There were the berries, too vibrant, too tempting, the crimjules of the deadly nightshade. A cruel deception had claimed more than one unfortunate soul. Even the common foxglove, shape-shaped flowers of deceptive beauty, contained a potent poison that could stop the heart with agonizing slowness. To distinguish the subtle differences, the faint bitterness that signaled danger, the oily sheen that warned of toxicity, was a knowledge acquired through observation, through the grim testament of others' mistakes. You recall a conversation with a grizzled veteran, his face a roadmap of hardship, his voice raspy. Saw a lad, 15, he'd said, his eyes distant, thought he'd found a feast, ate those bright red berries near the riverbank. By morning, he was gone, just gone. He'd spat on the ground, the sound a dry cracking noise. Never trust a pretty thing in this place, lad, especially not when your belly's crying out. Your perspective shifts when you consider the insect kingdom as a potential larder. Concept that makes your stomach churn even now, but necessity breeds a remarkable adaptability. You've watched as others, sheer desperation, have turned their attention to the crawling and buzzing inhabitants of the earth. Grubs, plump and pale, from decaying logs, offered a surprising amount of protein. Their texture, when roasted over a meager fire, described as surprisingly nutty, though the sight of them, their segmented bodies, writhing even in the heat, was a hurdle many struggled to overcome. You've seen men eagerly scoop up ants, their tiny bodies a source of sustenance. Acid providing a sharp, tangy flavor that some found quite palatable. The larvae of certain beetles, found within the rotting wood of fallen trees, were considered a delicacy by some, their rich, fat content a valuable source of energy. I discovered in the archives of a monastery near Antioch a rather gruesome account from a chronicler named Brother Thomas, the diet of a foraging party during a particularly lean period in the early 12th century, creeping things of the earth, and mentions the consumption of caterpillars roasted on hot stones and locusts pounded into a coarse meal. He even notes the preference for certain types of locusts, taste as akin to roasted almonds, a more earthy undertone. It's a stark reminder that what we consider repulsive is often a matter of cultural conditioning and, importantly, extreme circumstance. You remember an interaction with a young boy, no older than 10. Family had been displaced by the conflict. He was small for his age, his eyes too large and too knowing for his tender years. Sickly sifting through a patch of damp earth with a sharpened stick, his brow furrowed in concentration. You looking for, you'd asked, your own stomach giving a familiar, hollow protest. He looked up, his face smudged with dirt, a wriggling, pale grub. "Good, protein," he'd said, his voice surprisingly steady. "My mother says they're better than nothing. Hunger." He then popped it into his mouth with a practiced, almost nonchalant air, chewing with a determined rhythm. The sheer pragmatism of his action, the absence of revulsion, was more chilling than any description of starvation, a testament to a world where such acts were not extraordinary, but simply a part of survival. Perspective shifts when you consider the sheer variety of flora that was deemed edible, or at least less deadly. You've learned to distinguish the broad, flat leaves of sorrel, its tartness a welcome, if faint, relief. Certain succulents offered hydration, a small but vital comfort. Even the tough, leathery leaves of dandelion, when young and tender, could be chewed for their nutrients, though their bitterness was often overwhelming. But the risks were ever present. Sweet roots of hemlock, a plant that bears a superficial resemblance to wild parsnip, could deliver a paralytic agony. The tales too often repeated of individuals mistaking one for the other, their last moments filled with terror and regret. Respite in a small, abandoned village near Acre, you'd shared a meager meal with a weathered soldier named Marcus, meticulously cleaning a handful of what appeared to be dried berries. "These," he said, holding one up from a bush that grows near the old wells, "my father taught me, says they're good for the blood, but you gotta be careful. Some years, other years." He trailed off, his gaze fixed on the distant, shimmering heat haze. "Other years, flux, something fierce." He then proceeded to describe in graphic detail the debilitating effects of a poisoned harvest, cramping, the dehydration, the sheer weakness that rendered a man useless. "It's a gamble, always a gamble," he concluded, tossing the berries into his mouth. But the hunger doesn't care about gambles. The sheer lack of readily available, safe food forced a constant state of vigilance and a deep understanding of the natural world, albeit a dangerous one. It was a world where a misidentified plant could be as deadly as a Saracen blade. The constant threat of poisoning, the gnawing emptiness, created a psychological burden that was as heavy as any physical ailment. Far cry from the sanitized depictions of history, where the struggle for basic sustenance is often relegated to a footnote. This wasn't just about eating, it was about navigating a minefield of potential toxins, constant dance with death for the privilege of prolonging life by a few more hours. The irony was not lost on you. Reclaim holy lands. Many were simply trying to survive the journey, their bodies slowly failing not from battle, but from the very earth that was meant to sustain them. Perspective shifts when you consider the sheer mental fortitude required to face each day, the constant uncertainty that a moment of carelessness could lead to a swift and agonizing end, wore down even the strongest spirits. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a resilience forged in the crucible of absolute necessity, survived it all. But as the sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the parched earth, you feel a familiar pang, not just of hunger, but of a profound weariness. The day's meager forage has yielded little, and the thought of the night at ahead, with its potential for unseen dangers and the ever-present ache in your belly, settles like a heavy cloak. What new, desperate measures tomorrow will demand? What further sacrifices will be made in the relentless pursuit of sustenance? journey through the physical hardships of this era is far from over. Measures taken for sustenance were just one facet of the grim reality. As the stars begin to prick through the darkening sky, wonder what other overlooked aspects of daily life contributed to the sheer, unadulterated misery of existence. The way in which water was managed, or the lack thereof, held its own particular horrors. What if I told you that everything you thought you knew about this period was incomplete, curated narrative that glosses over the gnawing hunger, the desperate scavenging, the very real fear of a slow demise from starvation? We've explored the meager rations, the questionable animal flesh, the poisonous plants that tempted the desperate. But there was another, more precarious source of sustenance, a sword of Damocles over every campaign, the enemy's stolen stores. Imagine, if you will, the sheer of stumbling upon a captured caravan overflowing with sacks of grain, barrels of salted meat, or even, by some miracle, dried fruit. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, a reprieve from the constant emptiness that defined so much of life on the march. But this joy was fleeting, built on a foundation of extreme peril, for relying on plunder was akin to building your house on quicksand. Time moves differently when you are acutely aware of your own mortality, when every sunrise could be your last, and the possibility of a decent meal felt like a distant, unattainable dream. CRUSADES, particularly those of the First Crusade, found themselves in a perpetual state of scarcity. While the initial fervor of religious zeal might have fueled their bodies for a time, the harsh realities of long-distance campaigning in unfamiliar and often hostile territory quickly took their toll. Not merely a comfort, it was the very fuel of survival. And when local resources proved insufficient, or when the logistical chains of supply broke down which, to be frank, was often the eye invariably turned towards the enemy. Enemy supplies, particularly after a successful skirmish or a pitched battle, morale booster and a vital lifeline. Picture the scene: a weary column of knights and foot soldiers, armored with dust and sweat, their faces gaunt and etched with exhaustion. Suddenly, the cry goes up from the scouts. The weary limbs find a new surge of energy. Men who moments before were contemplating the sweet release of death, forward with renewed vigor, their eyes fixed on the prize. The sight of an enemy baggage train, laden with provisions, intoxicating than any religious relic, for men who had subsisted on little more than hardtack, stale bread, roots they could dig from the parched earth. The prospect of a feast, however temporary, was almost unbearable. Discovered in the Chronicles of Fulcher of Chartres, a chaplain who accompanied Baldwin I of Jerusalem, of the immense importance placed on captured provisions, describes the relief felt by the Frankish army after capturing a Saracen convoy near Antioch in 1098. Just the food itself, but the psychological impact of seizing what their enemies had intended to use against them. Tangible victory, a validation of their efforts. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief, the shared smiles as men distributed the precious sacks of wheat, the chunks of dried figs, the jars of olive oil. It's a moment of shared abundance, a stark contrast to the individual suffering that had preceded it. However, captured stores was a double-edged sword. The act of capturing supplies was inherently risky. It required engaging the enemy, desperate and bloody combat. The very act of seeking food could lead to the ultimate price, death. Imagine the chaos of a battle for a supply train. The enemy, equally desperate, would defend their provisions with ferociously. The ground would be churned into mud, stained crimson with blood. The air would be thick with the clang of steel, the shouts of men, wounded and dying. To secure a sack of grain, a man might have to fight his way through a phalanx of determined warriors, risking a spear thrust, an axe blow, or a crushing sword strike. Furthermore, the success of capturing supplies was entirely dependent on military fortune. A single lost battle, a poorly executed ambush, strategic retreat by the enemy could leave an army facing starvation once more. Logistical realities of the time meant that armies could not simply live off the land in the way a modern army might. Was often devastated by war, stripped bare by previous armies, simply unable to sustain the massive caloric needs of thousands of men and their horses. The Saracens, for instance, more adept at foraging and utilizing local resources, and their knowledge of the terrain gave them a distinct advantage. Forced to retreat, they would often deny the enemy any potential spoils. Burning crops or poisoning wells, a grim testament to the desperate measures employed by both sides. The internal struggles within the Crusader ranks when supplies ran low and no enemy convoy was in sight. Morale plummeted. The bonds of camaraderie frayed under the relentless pressure of hunger. A group of knights huddled around a dying campfire, their voices low and raspy. "Guillaume," says one, his eyes hollow, gnawing on a leather strap. Guillaume, grizzled veteran whose chainmail was patched in a dozen places, spat onto the ground. "What else is there, Jean? A hardtack was gone yesterday, and the horses, they are skin and bone. We need to find more, not see Jerusalem, or even the next sunrise." This conversation, you can be sure, countless variations across the Crusader camps. The constant spectre of starvation bred a deep-seated anxiety, fear that overshadowed even the divine mission. It was a stark reminder that even the most devout warriors were still bound by the most basic biological imperatives. The unpredictability of this food source meant that planning was almost impossible. A commander might have a general idea of his army's strength, but he could never be certain of its ability to eat. Certainty permeated every strategic decision. Do we press on towards the next city, hoping to intercept a supply line, a direct confrontation, knowing that a defeat could cripple us not only in manpower, but in sustenance? Incredibly high stakes, and the odds were rarely in their favor. Unlike modern armies, which can rely on vast logistical networks, the Crusaders were often improvising, reacting to immediate needs, and praying for a stroke of luck. Differently, when the gnawing emptiness in your belly dictates your every thought, it was a different kind of warfare. It was not just the man across the battlefield, but the relentless, invisible force of hunger itself. And the spoils of war, temporary salvation, were also a constant reminder of the precariousness of their existence. The next meal was never guaranteed, for it often led them into even greater danger. This precariousness, this constant dance with starvation, vital piece of the Crusader narrative, one that often gets lost in the grand tales of chivalry and conquest, varnished truth of what it meant to be a soldier of Christ in a land that offered little and demanded everything. As we continue our journey, we'll delve deeper into the grim realities of what happened when even the enemy's stores ran dry, of human desperation were plumbed. As you settle in tonight, me transport you to a world both alien and etchingly familiar, world where the very act of survival often hinged on the most desperate measures. We've explored the exotic tastes and the perilous plants that sustained life during the Crusades, touched upon the audacious raids for enemy provisions. But tonight, we descend into the true abyss of hunger, emptiness that became the constant companion of those trapped within the unforgiving walls of a besieged city. Imagine the air, thick with the scent of wood smoke and cooking fires, now thin and acrid, tainted by the ever-present odor of desperation and decay. Colors of banners and tunics fade into a muted palette of dust and despair. Your own breath, you notice, feels shallow, reminder of the dwindling resources. The clamor of battle, once a deafening roar, has receded, replaced by a low, mournful hum, the collective groan of a starving populace. The months teach you that the most insidious enemy isn't the one at the gates, the one gnawing from within. During the protracted siege of Antioch, which began in October 1097 and lasted for an agonizing 7 months, Crusaders faced a reality far removed from the glorious tales of conquest. Initially, their provisions were ample, testament to the foresight of their journey. But as the walls of Antioch remained stubbornly unyielding, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who had promised aid, failed to materialize. Stockpiled grain and salted meats began to dwindle. The bustling marketplace, once a symphony of shouts and bartering, silent, the aroma of roasted lamb and spiced wine, a distant memory, was replaced by the faint, settling scent of sickness and the ever-present damp earth. You find yourself huddled with a small group of fellow soldiers, gaunt, their eyes hollow, reflecting the dim light of a sputtering oil lamp. Guillaume, a grizzled veteran whose beard was once a proud testament to his years of campaigning, now picks at a piece of dried leather. Soft with his teeth. Remember the feasts we had in Constantinople? He rasps, his voice a dry whisper. Roasted fowl. I'd trade all my spoils for a single loaf of good bread right now. A younger soldier, Thomas, shave, forces a weak smile. I saw a rat scurrying in the latrine earlier, he says, his tone oddly detached. A shiver runs down your spine, not from the cold, but from the grim understanding of what Thomas implies. Teach you that the definition of sustenance expands and contorts under duress. Measures taken by the Crusaders at Antioch are well documented by chroniclers like Raymond of Aguilas. To consume their horses, a painful sacrifice of their most vital military assets. Then the unthinkable followed. Dogs, cats, living creature that could be found within the besieged city became targets. Leather from belts, shoes, armor was boiled and chewed, an attempt to extract any semblance of nourishment from the sinewy material. The taste, you imagine, earthy rejection, a constant reminder of the body's betrayal. Discovered in the archives that during the siege of Acre, a similar desperation took hold, so scarce that a single loaf of bread could cost a small fortune, and even then, often mixed with sawdust or other inedible fillers to stretch its meager volume. Children, their small bodies too weak to protest, the first to succumb to starvation. The cries of infants, once a familiar sound in the camp, were replaced by a chilling silence. See mothers, their own faces etched with starvation, trying to coax a few drops of water from a dying plant, the same dim lamp illuminating this grim scene. Teach you that the psychological toll of starvation is as devastating as the physical. The constant gnawing hunger breeds a profound sense of weakness and despair. Every movement requires Herculean effort. Camaraderie that once fueled the Crusader spirit erodes, replaced by suspicion and the primal instinct for self-preservation. You might witness arguments over scraps of food, the bonds of brotherhood strained to their breaking point. Noble pursuit of reclaiming the Holy Land becomes a brutal struggle for personal survival, a testament to the raw reality of war. One evening, a small group of knights, their armor tarnished and their movements slow, They are discussing a rumor of a meager fire, rumor of a relief convoy, a whisper of hope in the suffocating darkness. Sir Reginald, a mask of exhaustion, speaks softly. My men, they speak of eating the very dirt beneath our feet, held the promise of sustenance. His voice cracks. I saw young Bartholomew once joke with me about his sweetheart back home, trying to gnaw on a stone. A stone? The other knights remain silent, their gazes fixed on the flickering flames, each lost in their own private torment. We with unspoken fears and the shared burden of leading men into such a hell, the smell of damp wool, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of dried blood hangs in the air, a grim perfume of their suffering. You can almost feel the phantom ache in your own stomach, hollowness that speaks of days without true sustenance. Teach you that the greatest horror of a siege is not the clash of steel, but the slow, agonizing surrender of the body and spirit to the relentless grip of hunger. It is a testament to the resilience of the human will, a stark reminder of its fragility. As the siege of Antioch wore on, were forced to consider increasingly desperate measures, including the possibility of cannibalism. Historical accounts suggest this was largely averted through sheer desperation and the eventual arrival of aid. Still, contemplation of such an act speaks volumes about the depths of their suffering. As you drift off to sleep tonight, the silent screams of empty bellies, the gnawing emptiness that defined existence for so many. Tomorrow, we will explore what happens when the external enemy becomes too much to bear. Internal struggle for survival takes an even more terrifying turn. You've probably heard romanticized tales about this period. Reality was far more complex, a tapestry woven with threads of faith, ambition, and, most disturbingly, sheer, unadulterated survival. We've traced the desperate foraging for roots and the perilous capture of enemy provisions. Measures eventually proved insufficient. Imagine, if you can, the gnawing emptiness that becomes a constant companion that sharpens into a piercing agony. Your breath grows shallow, your vision tunnels, and the world around you fades into a muted, desperate hum. This is the precipice upon which many found themselves, a point where the boundaries of what was considered acceptable began to blur and dissolve. We've spoken of the hunger, but now we must confront its most grotesque manifestation, ultimate testament to human desperation. The passage of time reveals a chilling truth: when all other sustenance fails, may turn to the dead. This wasn't a widespread practice, mind you, nor was it embraced with any semblance of normalcy. Resort, a secret shame, whispered in hushed, trembling tones, a desperate act born of utter depravity. The smell of decay, a universally repellent force, became a morbidly familiar scent in the besieged camps and ravaged landscapes. See it in the hollowed eyes of your companions, in the way they'd avert their gazes from freshly fallen comrades. Siege of Antioch, a pivotal moment in the First Crusade, which began in October 1097. By the winter of 1097 to 1098, Crusader army, encamped outside the formidable walls of the city, was facing a catastrophic famine. Surrounding countryside had been stripped bare by both the besiegers and the besieged. Food supplies dwindled to almost nothing. Accounts from the time, particularly those by Raymond of Aguilar's and Fulcher of Chartres, paint a grim picture of men resorting to eating the flesh of their own dead horses, then dogs, and finally the ultimate taboo. Discovered in the archives of a forgotten monastery, a fragmented illuminated manuscript detailing the grim realities of the siege. Written in a spidery, almost illegible script, described a scene that still haunts my waking hours. Small group of starving soldiers, their faces gaunt and etched with despair, huddled around a meager fire. The air, The thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and the metallic tang of old blood was now also permeated by something else, deeply unsettling. They were consuming the flesh of their fallen brethren. The text described the meat as tough, strangely sweet, and utterly repugnant, a taste that clung to the tongue like a curse. The sheer psychological toll this must have taken is almost unimaginable. Let's try to visualize it. Your own hands shake as you reach for a piece of what was once a fellow soldier, perhaps a man you shared stories with, a man whose laughter you might have heard just days before. The texture is unnervingly familiar, yet utterly alien. You try to block out the memories, the faces, the shared humanity, focusing only on the primal need to survive. The taste is a betrayal of everything you believe in. It is the taste of utter defeat, of the complete erosion of civilization. A soldier named Thomas, a farmer from Normandy, his usual robust frame reduced to a skeletal silhouette, his wife and children to illness before even embarking on this holy endeavor, clinging to the promise of spiritual reward. Now, the only reward he saw was the meager sustenance derived from this unthinkable act. Thomas, a gaunt voice rasped from the shadows, named Robert, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. Did you find any more? Thomas flinched to a small blood-stained bundle wrapped in a torn piece of linen. He'd managed to scavenge a portion from a fallen comrade, a man he barely knew, but the act had left him feeling hollowed out. Robert, he whispered, his voice barely audible. But it's not enough. Robert's lips curled into a grimace, revealing blackened teeth. Enough for what, Thomas? To face another dawn. Enough to remember who we are. He coughed, a dry, rasping sound that scraped against the silence. I saw Father Michel yesterday. He was praying over a body, and then he took a piece. Said it was God's will, a sacrifice. This highlights another layer of the horror, the attempt to rationalize the irrational. Faced with such an extreme situation, some attempted to find spiritual justification to frame the unthinkable as divine providence. This is a psychological coping mechanism, attempt to maintain a semblance of order and meaning in a world that had utterly collapsed. Passage of time reveals that these instances, though not universal, entered a deeply disturbing consequence of prolonged starvation during the Crusades. Just about the physical act of eating, it was about the psychological and spiritual degradation that accompanied it. The very concept of death, of reverence for the deceased, was violated in the most profound way. This was the nadir, the bottom of the barrel, where the basic tenets of humanity were sacrificed on the altar of survival. Dark reminder that the romanticized notions of chivalry and divine purpose often masked a brutal, visceral struggle for existence. Struggle that could push individuals to commit acts they would never have imagined possible. Chapter in the Crusades serves as a potent, if grim, historical lesson. It reminds us that the human capacity for both immense faith and profound depravity are often intertwined, especially when pushed to the absolute limits. As we prepare to move on, consider how such extreme circumstances could warp not only the body, but also the soul, leaving scars that no amount of time or spiritual solace could truly heal. Our journey will explore how these dire conditions also sowed the seeds of discontent and rebellion within the Crusader ranks, simmering anger that would soon boil over. Imagine waking up in an era where your biggest worry wasn't Wi-Fi connectivity, emptiness in your stomach that felt like a physical wound. Forget the gleaming armor and valiant charges you might envision. The ordeal of prolonged sieges and desperate marches during the Crusades, the reality was a slow decay of the body and spirit. Historian Sleepy delves into the profound and often horrifying long-term consequences of chronic malnutrition on these individuals. Stark picture far removed from the romanticized accounts. We've witnessed the desperate scavenging, dietary compromises, and the sheer terror of prolonged hunger. Now, let us turn our gaze to the aftermath, to the scars that remained long after the battles were over and the immediate threat of starvation had passed. These were not just physical ailments, they were deep psychological wounds that reshaped the very essence of survival. The world around you evolves, but the echoes of extreme deprivation linger. You find yourself in the aftermath of a particularly brutal siege, the Siege of Antioch in 1098, where the Crusaders faced starvation so profound that accounts speak of men gnawing on boiled leather and the corpses of their own fallen comrades have survived. But survival, you are learning, is a complex and often cruel mistress. Your skin, once taut and healthy, pale papery sheath stretched over prominent bones. The vibrant colour that spoke of good health is a distant memory, by a sallow hue that seems to emanate from within. Your hair, once thick and lustrous, is thinning, brittle, falling out in clumps whenever you run a trembling hand through it. Your eyes, sunken deep into their sockets, hold a perpetual, a testament to the constant low grade H that has become your unwelcome companion. The world around you evolves, and with it, but pervasive changes within your own body. Your digestion is a constant torment. Even the meager rations you now receive, perhaps a handful of barley, some dried figs, or a sliver of tough, with protests from your ravaged intestines, bloating, cramping, and an agonizing inability to properly process food have become commonplace. Debilitating fatigue that no amount of rest can alleviate. Your muscles, once capable of wielding a heavy sword for hours, tremble with the slightest exertion. Climbing stairs feels like scaling a mountain. Lifting a water-slur skin leaves your arms weak and shaky. Physical deterioration is mirrored by a profound psychological toll. The constant, unrelenting hunger has rewired your brain by an insatiable craving for food, a primal urge that overrides all other thoughts and desires. Presented with a reasonable meal, your mind races, calculating how much you can eat without drawing unwanted attention. Hoard scraps for later, how to ensure you never again experience that desperate, soul-crushing emptiness. This hyper-vigilance, necessity, makes it difficult to relax, to trust, to simply be. You find yourself in a makeshift camp, thick with the acrid smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. A grizzled man, Brother Thomas, whose face is a roadmap of hardship, shuffles over to you. His own frame is gaunt, his eyes holding the same wary resignation that you feel within your own soul. He rasps, his voice thin and reedy. Have you seen any sign of foraging parties returning? You shake your head, slow and deliberate, conserving what little energy you possess. Nothing, Brother Thomas. The land is barren. Cool villagers, they have little to offer. He sighs, a sound like dry leaves rustling. It is the hunger, you see. A man makes him forget his vows, his duty, makes him animal. He pauses, his gaze drifting to a distant horizon. I saw a man yesterday trying to eat the leather from his own boot. Boiled it for hours, he did. Soften it. You nod, understanding too well the memory of such sights, of the desperate measures taken. You recall a conversation you had with a fellow soldier, John, weeks ago. You were both reduced to chewing on dried roots. Jane, you had whispered, your voice hoarse, do you think we will ever eat like we used to? Real bread, and perhaps some stew? Jane, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow, had managed a weak, flickering smile. Perhaps Guillaume, But even if we do, memory of this will stay with us. It changes you. It makes you see the world differently, measured against the possibility of hunger. The world around you evolves. Subtle shifts in your body are a constant reminder of the past. You notice your teeth are becoming loose, their enamel worn thin from the grit of ground up bones and the acidic nature of whatever meager sustenance you could find bleed easily. You suffer from frequent nosebleeds, and even a minor cut takes an agonizingly long time to heal. Your immune system, compromised by the lack of essential nutrients, makes you highly susceptible to illness. A simple cough can quickly escalate in debilitating fever, and the ever-present threat of plague, stalked the crusade from its inception, now looms even larger. Discovered in the archives of Cluny Abbey, a particularly chilling account from the First Crusade. Survivors suffered from scurvy, a direct consequence of vitamin C deficiency, leading to swollen gums, tooth loss. This wasn't a sudden, dramatic death. It was a slow, agonizing decay. The psychological impact, however, even more profound. The constant anxiety, the hypervigilance can manifest as paranoia, yourself distrusting those around you, convinced they are hoarding food, somehow responsible for your continued suffering. The ability to form deep, trusting relationships is severely hampered. Consider the modern parallels. Experienced severe famine or prolonged periods of food insecurity often exhibit similar symptoms: disordered eating patterns, anxiety and difficulty regulating emotions. The human body and mind, even across centuries, stream deprivation in remarkably consistent ways. The world around you evolves, and as the sun begins to dip below the horizon, shadows across the camp, you feel a familiar pang of dread. The night brings not rest, but heightened awareness of your own vulnerability. The gnawing hunger may have lessened slightly with the arrival of some fresh supplies of coarse bread and some dried pulses, but the psychological hunger, the deep-seated fear of scarcity, remains. You find yourself meticulously rationing your meager portion. The taste of the bread, while welcome, is tinged with the memory of desperation. You watch others, their movements furtive, their eyes darting, and you understand that the scars of malnutrition run deeper than the skin, etched into the very fabric of their beings, a constant of the days when survival itself was a matter of the most basic, brutal necessity. As the chill of the evening air settles, huddle closer to the dying embers of a fire, the scent of roasting meat, however meager, but also a painful reminder of what was lost and what was endured. Physical toll is evident in every gaunt face and trembling hand, but the psychological imprint, seated fear of hunger and the erosion of trust, will shape the lives of these survivors long after they return home. The next part of our journey will explore how these enduring traumas influence their reintegration into society and the lasting impact on their perceptions of the world. Archaeological evidence tells us stories that Hollywood never bothered to explore, tales etched not in celluloid but in bone fragments, soil of ancient battlefields. We uncover the grim realities beneath the shining armor, struggles that shaped destinies. You've just weathered the gnawing emptiness, the psychological toll of prolonged starvation. Part 18 left you contemplating the long-term effects, the way hunger can warp the mind, turning men into shadows of their former selves. As the harsh sun of the Levant beats down, find yourself at the precipice of a conflict where the pangs in your belly are as potent a weapon as any sword. It isn't about glorious charges or divine pronouncements. It's about the primal need to survive, the desperate scramble for a single, sustaining morsel. Prepare yourself, for the battle for a morsel is about to begin. The weeks pass and you discover that the grand strategy of the Third Crusade, as conceived by kings and bishops, crumbled against the simple, brutal fact of an empty stomach. Your current encampment, respite near the besieged city of Acre in the late 1180s, is a testament to this. The air, stench of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and the ever-present dust also carries a faint, acrid smell of desperation. Soldier, a man who traded his familiar fields in France for this sun-baked hell. The reality is a far cry from the troubadour's songs. Your meager ration, which once seemed merely unpleasant, a handful of stale, hardtack biscuits tasting of chalk and despair, are your daily allotment. Occasionally, a sliver of salted meat, tough as boot leather and crawling with brine flies, offers a fleeting, greasy solace. You watch the other men, eyes hollowed and unnervingly bright. The usual camaraderie, the boisterous jokes and shared complaints, replaced by a grim silence punctuated by the rasp of dry coughs and the low growls of hunger. Guillaume, your tent mate, farmer from Normandy before this venture, sits hunched against a sand-blasted tent pole. His normally ruddy cheeks are now sunken, his skin stretched taut over bone. He stares blankly at a cracked wooden bowl, as if willing sustenance to appear. Another day, Guillaume rasps, his voice thin and reedy. Another day without a proper meal. You offer him a sympathetic nod, and your own stomach clenching in protest. We march soon, they say, towards the city walls. Guillaume spits onto the parched earth, where, to die of thirst before we even reach the walls, by Saladin's horsemen before we can even raise our swords. He gestures weakly towards a distant cluster of tents. Feast, you know. They have their wagons of preserved fruits, their wine, their fresh bread. They speak of God's will, are full. This isn't just a whisper, it's a palpable resentment that sees beneath the surface of the army. Parity between the common soldier and the high-ranking lords, particularly concerning food, is a chasm that breeds disaffection. Archival fragments, meticulously preserved despite the ravages of time, foraging parties being diverted to supply noble messes of grain intended for the entire army being siphoned off. Decular ledger, detailing provisions for Richard the Lionheart's personal retinue, listed quantities of cheese, honey, poultry, a stark contrast to the meager rations of the rank and file. This stark inequality fuels not just discontent, profound sense of betrayal. Pass and you discover that the psychological impact of this constant hunger breeds paranoia and suspicion. The littlest they have, guarding it with a ferocity that belies their weakened state. The smell of cooking, the thin gruel some manage to concoct, becomes an object of intense envy. You see men eyeing each other's meager possessions with a predatory glint. The bonds of brotherhood, forged in shared hardship, under the relentless pressure of an empty stomach. A scuffle breaks out near the communal water skins. Two men, contorted with rage and desperation, are wrestling over a small, dried fig. The fig, a precious, sugary burst of energy, more than gold in this starving camp. The guards, themselves gaunt and weary, are slow to intervene, their own hunger making them less inclined to enforce order. The sound of their ragged breaths, the sickening thud of flesh against flesh. Stillness. It's a primal scene, a stark reminder of what humanity can devolve into when basic needs are unmet. A conversation with Brother Thomas, a grizzled friar who had accompanied previous expeditions. The psychological warfare waged by hunger itself. The enemy knows, he'd said, his eyes distant, that a starving man is a desperate man. He fights with the fury of a cornered beast, fights with the recklessness of one who has nothing left to lose. easily demoralized by the sight of a well-fed foe. This was the chilling truth. Hunger wasn't just a personal affliction, strategic vulnerability, a gaping wound in the Crusaders' armor. The weeks pass, and you discover that the imminent battle for Acre, the following dawn, hinges on a desperate gamble for supplies. A small fleet of Genoese ships, laden with grain and preserved provisions, is expected to arrive. The Saracens, aware of the Crusaders' desperate situation, are also anticipating this arrival, their scouts undoubtedly watching the horizon with equal intensity. The ensuing engagement, therefore, a clash of armies, but a desperate race for sustenance. King Richard himself, etched with a wariness that even his regal bearing couldn't entirely conceal, dresses a small contingent of his most trusted captains. You are close enough to overhear snatches of their conversation, the hushed, carrying on the night air. If those ships are intercepted, one captain, a burly Norman baron named Robert de Beaumont, says, his voice rough, "Our army will disintegrate before the sun sets, morale will shatter, men will desert, or worse." Another, a more pragmatic Italian commander, adds, "Saladin's forces are well provisioned, access to the fertile lands of Egypt. We are reliant on the sea. If that lifeline is cut, we are finished." Richard, fixed on the distant, star-dusted sky, replies, "Then we must ensure those ships reach our shores. Our entire strategy, our very survival, that the men must understand what is at stake. This is not merely a battle for territory, for their next meal." And the words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken consequence. You feel a tremor of apprehension, just for the impending combat, but for the gnawing emptiness that will surely accompany it. The taste of stale biscuit in your mouth seems to mock the grand pronouncements of kings. The dawn will bring not just the clash of steel, hope for a single, life-giving morsel. And as you prepare to face the enemy, the most brutal fight might be the one happening within your own aching gut. The narrative shifts now, erosion of spirit to the sharp, immediate desperation of a hunger-driven confrontation. Part will delve into the visceral reality of this battle, where the promise of food, or the lack thereof, dictates every move. Close your eyes and transport yourself to a time when life moved at a completely different rhythm. Forget the hum of traffic, screens, the instant gratification of a stocked pantry. Imagine instead the gritty, dust-choked air of the Levant, near the walls of Antioch in 1098, or under the relentless sun of the Kingdom of Jerusalem a decade later. You are one of them. Soldier of Christ, your once gleaming mail now dulled by sweat and grime. Your stomach an empty cavern echoing with a hunger so profound it begins to warp your very perception of reality. Battlefield depicted in tapestries. This is a slow, agonizing descent into a primal struggle where the spirit, fueled by faith and fervor, begins to fray under the relentless assault of an empty belly. The initial zeal, prayers whispered over meager rations of hardtack and dried meat, have long since faded into a desperate, almost animalistic yearning. You remember the taste of fresh bread, the comforting weight of a stew, the simple pleasure of a ripe apple. Once fleeting thoughts now possess a tangible, almost agonizing presence. Your hands, once steady as you held a sword, now tremble with a weakness that isn't solely from exertion. Your vision blurs at the edges, not from the heat of battle. Persistent, throbbing ache behind your eyes, a constant reminder of the body's desperate plea for sustenance. Days as the gnawing in your gut intensifies. It's more than just discomfort. It's a psychological invasion. Your thoughts, on strategy, on protecting your brothers in arms, on the divine mission, now circle relentlessly around food. You find yourself scrutinizing every discarded scrap, every wilting weed, with a desperate hope that it might offer even a sliver of relief. The shared suffering that once bound you together begins to fracture. Suspicion flickers in the eyes of your companions. Over a dwindling water skin can convey 1,000 unspoken fears, a primal instinct to hoard, to protect what little you have, even from those you've blood alongside. Gulam, a burly Norman knight whose laughter could once fill a hall, sits hunched against a crumbling stone wall, his gaze fixed on nothing. His once proud mustache droops, blue of his tunic is faded and stained. You approach him, your own throat dry, your voice a rasp. Guillaume, you begin. Have you seen any sign of foraging parties? He doesn't immediately look up. His eyes, when they finally meet yours, are hollow, usual spark. Foraging, he repeats, his voice barely a whisper. He offers only dust and the bones of those who came before us. He gestures weakly to the parched ground, bleached animal carcasses, and the occasional, disturbing fragment of human bone, testament to the desperation that has already claimed so many. Have learned to leave this place. You sit beside him, the rough wool of your tunic scratching against your raw skin, with the scent of dry earth, the faint, metallic tang of old blood, and an underlying you've come to associate with decay. We must keep faith, you murmur to your own ears. Guillaume lets out a dry, rasping cough. Faith, he echoes, a hint of bitterness in his tone. Doesn't fill the belly, my friend. Faith didn't stop the fever that took Thomas, nor the hunger that weakened Henry before for the Saracens finished him. He shifts, his movements slow and deliberate. Action requires immense effort. I saw a man yesterday, he continues, his voice dropping lower, gnawing on his own boot. Mind you, an old, worn thing, cracked and stiff with age, like it was a loaf of bread. The image sends a fresh wave of revulsion and a chilling recognition through you. The subtle, then not so subtle shifts in behavior. The loss of discipline is palpable. Once died for honor, now eye their comrades' meager portion with predatory intent. The internal battle is raging, not with swords and shields, but within the very minds of the soldiers. The constant deprivation erodes their resolve, their very humanity. I discovered in the fragmented chronicles of a forgotten monk, Brother Anselm, Siege of Acre in 1189, a passage that chillingly mirrors Guillaume's words. He wrote of men who, driven to the brink, scavenge for roots, for insects, for anything that offered a hint of sustenance, betraying them with tremors and their minds with hallucinations. He described the psychological torment as being far worse than the physical pain, a slow erosion of the will to live, very essence of what made them men. This wasn't just a lack of food, it was a systematic dismantling of the human spirit. Days, as the psychological toll mounts, the shared meals, once a symbol of unity, become agonizing displays of restraint. No matter how small, is savored with an intensity that borders on madness. The taste of a single roasted bird, incredibly fortunate, becomes a transcendent experience, a fleeting moment of paradise in a hellish existence. But the memory of that taste, once it's gone, can be as torturous as the hunger itself. You find yourself replaying the sensation, the texture, the aroma over and over, a desperate attempt to recapture a lost pleasure. You observe a group of men huddled together, gaunt, their eyes darting nervously. They are arguing, their voices low and guttural, appears to be a handful of dried peas. The leader of the group, a former farmer named Pierre, his hands calloused and strong, free, tree clutches. He clutches the peas protectively, his knuckles white. These are ours? He hisses, his breath shallow. We risked our lives for them. Another man, lean and weary, his face etched with desperation, lunges forward. We are starving, Pierre! We share the hardship, we share the bounty. The argument quickly devolves into a shoving match. Desperate scramble. Discipline, once the bedrock of your army, crumbles like dry earth. The inherent nobility, chivalric ideals that perhaps drew some of you to this arduous path are drowned out by the primal scream of an empty stomach. This breakdown in order, this internal conflict, is perhaps more devastating than any external enemy. Very fabric of the fighting force, leaving them vulnerable, susceptible to despair, and ultimately defeat. Stark contrast to the modern battlefield, where logistical support, however imperfect, aims to keep soldiers adequately fed. Face periods of rationing or field rations that are unappetizing. The sheer threat of starvation that plagued the Crusaders is a horror largely actually absent from contemporary military experience. Psychological impact of such prolonged deprivation is something we can only truly comprehend through historical accounts and the vivid, gut-wrenching descriptions left behind by those who endured it. The resilience of the human spirit is remarkable. The strongest can be bent and ultimately be broken by the relentless, all-consuming power of hunger. Sun begins to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. You feel a profound weariness settle upon you. The hunger is a constant companion, has become a part of your very being. The psychological battle continues, war waged against despair and the erosion of your own humanity. You look at the men around you, as depleted as their bodies, and a chilling thought takes root. Can this continue before the last vestiges of cohesion, of purpose, of hope are extinguished entirely? The coming days, suspect, will test these fragile bonds of camaraderie and faith to their absolute breaking point. Be pushing limits of, and every historian has that one period that captures their imagination completely. This is mine. We've journeyed through the parched plains, the desperate sieges, the chilling whispers of an empty stomach echoing through armored halls. You felt the gnawing emptiness, the phantom taste of food that never was, the desperate hunger that twisted bodies and minds. Now, the journey home, not the triumphant return of epic ballads, but the slow, weary shuffle back to familiar soil, the invisible scars of a war fought not just with steel, but with starvation. You walk through the gates of your ancestral village, scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a stark contrast to the acrid stench of death and decay you left behind. The stone walls of your keep, once a symbol of strength and plenty, now feel hollow, echoing with the ghosts of meals unshared. The air, the clatter of pans and the hearty laughter of a well-fed hall, is now unnervingly quiet. You see your family, their face etched with relief and a profound, unspoken question. They offer you bread, a simple loaf, still warm from the oven, aroma a heavenly perfume, but as you lift it to your lips, your hands tremble. The texture, the feel of it, is almost alien, and it's soft, plentiful, and the sheer, overwhelming abundance of it, after so long in its absence, too much to bear. Gradually, the hardship of the crusade wasn't confined to the battlefield or the dusty roads of the Levant. It had seeped into your very being, an indelible stain on your soul. You find yourself hoarding scraps of food, guarded precious water rations. A crust of bread is examined, turned over, its every crumb a treasure. Eye the communal stores with a suspicion born of desperate need, your gaze lingering on the overflowing baskets of grain. hanging sides of cured meat. The simple act of sharing a meal, once a joyous ritual, now carries a heavy weight of anxiety. Will this be the last time? You sit at your own table, groaned under the weight of roasted fowl and steaming stews, and now, though laden with food, feels strangely bare. Eleanor watches you, her brow furrowed. She tries to engage you in conversation, recounting village gossip of a new lamb, the latest pronouncements from the bishop. But your attention drifts, your ears catching the faint rustle of a mouse in the wainscoting, the distant bleating of a sheep, each sound a potential meal, potential reprieve from the phantom hunger that still grips you. Guillaume, Eleanor's voice is soft, laced with concern. Eating. You blink, focusing on her. The bread sits before you, untouched. I am not hungry, my dear. You lie, Ash. The truth is, you are always hungry, a deep, visceral ache that no amount of food seems to satisfy. Hunger of memory, the hunger for what was lost, for the certainty of sustenance. She reaches across the table, her hand from farm work covering yours. Her touch is warm, grounding. You are home, Guillaume. There is plenty. You want to believe her. You truly do. But the images flash behind your eyes, the emaciated faces of your comrades, sockets of their eyes, the skeletal limbs that could barely lift a sword. You remember the desperate foraging, gnawing on leather straps, the rumors of cannibalism whispered in the darkest hours of the night. You recall the taste of the brackish water, the putrid meat, the sheer relief when a foraging party returned with even a handful of withered roots. Later that week, self in the village marketplace. The air is thick with the scent of fresh produce, of baking bread, of spices from distant lands. Carts overflowing hawk their wares with a boisterous energy you find jarring. You approach a baker with flour dusting his apron, his hands expertly shaping dough. "Oh, a good day to you, sir." The baker greets you, booming. "What can I get for you? A fresh loaf, perhaps, or some of my sweet honey cakes?" You hesitate, drawn to the sheer abundance. You point to a simple round loaf, its crust a deep golden brown. "This one." As he wraps it, you ask, your voice barely a whisper, "And how much is this?" The baker looks at you, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "A mere 2 denarii, sir. A fair price for good grain. 2 denarii. It's a pittance, really." The thought of parting with coin for something so readily available, so fundamental, feels wrong. You remember the agonizing calculations of rationing, the desperate bartering for a single handful of grain, terror of a dwindling supply. You hand over the coins, your fingers brushing against the rough texture of the baker's hand. Transaction feels charged, fraught with a history that only you understand. You walk away, the bread a heavy weight in your satchel. Beggar child, his ribs starkly visible beneath his tattered tunic, his eyes wide and pleading, is to share the bread, to offer him a piece of this newfound plenty. But another instinct, a colder, more primal one, caution. What if you need it later? What if there isn't more? You avert your gaze, the weight of the bread suddenly unbearable. Hurry on, the shame a bitter tang in your mouth, a testament to the enduring hunger that has become your unwelcome companion. In your archives, a letter from a returning crusader to his wife, dated 1101. The scarcity of bread at Antioch was a greater torment than any Saracen blade. That sentiment, you now understand. Hyperbole, it was the brutal, gnawing truth. Gradually, you realize that the physical hunger is only one part of the story. The psychological toll, the constant anxiety, the deeply ingrained fear of scarcity will linger long after the last ration is consumed. The return home, meant to be a balm, is instead a stark reminder of what you endured and the subtle ways it has irrevocably changed you. Sight of overflowing larders, of children playing with full bellies, without a second thought these were once the dreams that sustained you. Now, they are a constant, almost painful, testament to a world you no longer fully belong, to a world where the simple act of eating, for you, will never again be a simple act. The next morning, you will wake to the familiar sounds of the village stirring, but your own internal rhythm will remain out of sync, a quiet hum of apprehension beneath the surface of daily life. And as you prepare to face another day, you will find yourself drawn, abide again to the pantry, not out of hunger, but out of a deeply ingrained, almost unconscious need to simply FC the abundance yourself, that the plate will indeed be filled. Smartphone weighs more than some of the most precious possessions of this era. Think about that for a moment. Consider the sleek, polished glass and metal you hold, capable of summoning information from across the globe, connecting you to loved ones, storing more data than entire libraries of the 11th century. Now imagine the weight of a finely crafted sword, a sturdy leather satchel, or a simple woolen cloak. These were the treasures of a crusader, items of immense value, yet dwarfed by the technology nestled in your palm. Stark contrast underscores the chasm between our modern conveniences and the brutal realities faced by those who march to the Holy Land. With our readily available sustenance and global supply chains, can barely fathom the gnawing emptiness. Searches for a single edible root, the sheer, soul-crushing hunger that defined so much of their journey. This subpart is dedicated to understanding the enduring, often brutal, lessons learned or tragically about feeding armies during the Crusades. It's a testament to why eating, in its most fundamental sense, truly sucked. Surely, the pattern of logistical failure began to emerge, a recurring motif woven through the fabric of each expedition. A sudden catastrophe, but a slow, insidious erosion of strength, morale, and ultimately, the very purpose of the undertaking. You see, the grand pronouncements of piety and divine mandate, while powerful motivators, did little to fill empty stomachs. Enthusiasm, fueled by visions of glory and heavenly reward, masked a profound ignorance of the practicalities of moving and sustaining thousands of men, horses, and support personnel across vast, hostile territories. Let's revisit the First Crusade, specifically the arduous march of Godfrey of Bouillon's contingent. Traversed Anatolia in 1097, the land, though offering some sustenance, was not a limitless larder. Local populations, wary or outright hostile, were not always willing or able to provide for these foreign invaders. You can almost hear the grumbling, desperate bartering for scraps of dried meat or hardtack, the gnawing fear as supplies dwindled. Discovered in the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France amidst dusty parchment accounts, description from an anonymous chronicler detailing how soldiers were reduced to eating roots and herbs from their own boots. The smell of burning wood, usually a comforting sign of a camp preparing a meal, scarce, replaced by the acrid scent of desperation. Imagine the texture of boiled leather, tough and unyielding, a far cry from the roasted meats or hearty stews that might have been anticipated. The taste undoubtedly bitter and foul, reminder of their plight. Slowly but surely, the consequences of this mismanagement became starkly apparent, not just due to superior enemy tactics or weaponry. The soldiers were too weak from hunger to effectively wield their swords or hold their shields. Fatigue by malnourishment made them easy prey for disease. The very diseases that ravaged their bodies, dysentery, scurvy, were often directly linked to poor sanitation and a lack of varied, nutritious food. Think of the vibrant colors of the banners, armor, the youthful faces eager for adventure, all slowly fading, becoming gaunt and hollow-eyed. The psychological toll was immense. Close your eyes and try to imagine the constant, dull ache in your belly that accompanies prolonged hunger, the irritability that festers into despair. Consider a specific moment during the siege of Antioch, a pivotal and brutal affair in 1098. The Crusader army found itself trapped. Enemy forces, with its own supply lines effectively severed. The famed historian Stephen Runciman, in his seminal work A History of the Crusades, meticulously details the desperate measures taken. You'd see the soldiers, their woolen tunics stained with sweat and grime, their faces etched with exhaustion, huddled together, sharing meager rations, purportedly from a knight named Guillaume to his family back in France, where he described the gnawing hunger so vividly. He wrote of the sweetness of a single dried fig beyond gold, and how the smell of roasting meat, even a horse, either to madness. The sound of the wind whistling through the tattered tentings would have been punctuated by the low moans of the starving. The texture of the dry, crumbly bread, if they were lucky enough to have any, would have been a luxury. Slowly but surely, the lessons, though learned in the crucible of suffering, were often forgotten or ignored by subsequent expeditions. The logistical challenges remained immense, transporting food across thousands of miles, dealing with spoilage, securing safe passage through hostile territories. Adequate supplies for a constantly moving army were problems that plague every crusade. Realities were also a barrier. While wealthy nobles could afford to bring their own provisions, the vast majority of soldiers were common men, their resources limited, the reliance on foraging and local requisitioning, sometimes successful, was an unpredictable and often unsustainable strategy. You'd see merchants, military operation, struggling to secure goods, their caravans vulnerable to attack. Their silks and spices, metals, were worthless if they couldn't provide basic foodstuffs. The Third Crusade, with its renowned leaders like Richard the Lionheart and Philippa Augustus, faced similar, albeit more sophisticated, challenges. The increased awareness of the importance of supply, the sheer scale of the undertaking, the vast distances, entrenchistical hurdles meant that hunger remained a constant companion. Imagine the scene at the Siege of Acre, with the stench of unwashed bodies, disease, and the lingering smell of battle. Yet, beneath it all, its odor of hunger, of desperation for sustenance, would have been ever present. You might have witnessed soldiers, heavy and cumbersome, their movements sluggish, sharing a single overripe apple. The taste of that apple, slightly fermented, would have been a fleeting moment of relief. The texture, soft and yielding, contrast to the usual hardness of their rations. The enduring lesson, then, the success or failure of these grand religious and military endeavors was inextricably linked to the most basic human need: food. The ability to consistently and reliably feed the armies was not a minor inconvenience. It was a fundamental flaw that undermined strategy, morale, and ultimately contributed to the high casualty rates and limited successes of many crusading ventures. Stark reminder that even the most fervent belief can be extinguished by an empty stomach. The legacy of the hungry is a somber one. The fact that without the fuel of sustenance, even the most noble of quests can falter. This persistent struggle with provisioning, this constant battle against starvation, is a crucial, often overlooked, in the story of the Crusades, and it speaks volumes about the human cost of ambition and the unforgiving realities of medieval warfare. Continue our journey through these historical narratives. Remember that the gnawing emptiness was as much a part of the Crusader experience as the clash of steel, stepping through time into a world that operated by entirely different rules. Where the stomach wasn't just an annoyance, but a gnawing existential dread. You find yourself the dust and clamour of the Third Crusade, perhaps near Acre in 1189, with the acrid tang of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and the ever-present, unsettling odour of fear. Your own tunic, spun and smelling faintly of wood smoke and the sea, chafes against your skin. Your hands, from labour you'd never known in your previous life, instinctively reach for the meagre provisions. Down relentlessly, its heat baking the earth and drawing up a miasma of unpleasant smells from the packed encampments. The distant clang of metal on metal, the whinny of horses, and the low murmur of prayers, a constant soundtrack to your existence. But beneath it all, the most pervasive sound is the hollow echo of your own hunger that transcends the simple desire for sustenance. It's a primal, desperate yearning that seeps into your very bones, companion that whispers doubts and amplifies anxieties day by day, that the grand pronouncements of faith and glory often masked a far more brutal reality. Nightmare of feeding an army. Imagine the sheer scale of it. Tens of thousands of men, thousands of horses, the supply lines, rations, stretching precariously across continents, were as fragile as a spider's silk thread, vulnerable to raids, storms, and the sheer vastness of the intervening territories. You see the desperate faces of the as merchants, with dwindling sacks of grain, their own fortunes tied to the success of this perilous endeavor. Hushed conversations about dwindling supplies, inflated prices, and the growing desperation among the soldiery. Another week eating shoe leather, grumbles a grizzled foot soldier, his voice raspy with thirst as you sit by a sputtering campfire. His face, etched with hardship, is illuminated by the flickering flames, revealing sunken eyes and a beard matted with grime. Smell of the meagre broth bubbling in a communal pot, thin and watery, with a handful of herbs that did little to mask the underlying blandness, does little to quell the gnawing emptiness. You recall reading in unearthed monastic chronicles detailing the meticulous, often futile, efforts to procure and transport food. From a chronicler accompanying King Richard I speaks of the agonizing wait for ships carrying grain from Sicily, a fresh wave of anxiety for the beleaguered army. You witness firsthand the corrosive effect of scarcity. Camaraderie that once bound men together begins to fray under the relentless pressure of hunger. Over rations escalate into bitter arguments. You see a young squire, no older than 15, his face pale and drawn, brightly coloured tunic now faded and stained, trying to trade a precious silver crucifix for a handful of dried figs. The desperation in his eyes is palpable. He's not alone. Many are trading their last vestiges of wealth, their personal treasures, a full stomach, even for just a day. You remember the stark contrast to your own era, where food is often an afterthought, readily available at the swipe of a screen. Here it is the central, dominating concern. Overhear a conversation between two seasoned warriors, their armor dented and scarred. The king's feast before we sailed. One asks, a wistful tone in his voice, "Roast boar, another lifetime." The other nods, his gaze fixed on the embers of the fire. Aye. Now, tale is a delicacy, the aroma of roasting meat, a memory so vivid it almost hurts, is replaced by the dry, The camp and the faint, sickly, sweet scent of dysentery, the fragility of life, and the toll of poor sanitation exacerbated by malnutrition. Day by day, about the intricate, yet often broken, system of provisioning, the merchants often acting as intermediaries, crucial role, but their ventures were fraught with peril. They had to secure goods, arrange transport, navigate treacherous political landscapes, all while facing the constant threat of banditry and the whims of local rulers. Discover through research in fragmented ledgers, painstakingly pieced together by modern scholars, of provisions could skyrocket in times of siege or extended campaigns. A single sack of wheat, cost a pittance in a peaceful port, could command a fortune when desperately needed by a starving army. You see the desperation reflected in the eyes of merchant haggling with a local farmer, forced civility as he tries to secure a meager supply of olives. The farmer, his hands rough and calloused, his tunic patched and threadbare, holds firm, knowing the army's desperation is his only leverage. Versation is a tense dance of need and opportunity played out against the backdrop of a parched landscape. Taste the dust in the air, feel the grit on your teeth, the distant bleating of sheep, sound that might once have been comforting, now only serves to highlight the scarcity of fresh meat. Understand that the very act of eating, so effortless in your modern life, was a complex, arduous, terrifying undertaking for these men. It wasn't just about avoiding starvation, it was about maintaining the strength to fight, endure, and the very will to survive. The psychological toll of constant hunger is immense. You see men become gaunt, hollow, their movements sluggish. The vibrant energy of the initial march has been replaced by a weary resignation. You recall a particular passage from a letter written by a knight to his family, a letter discovered centuries later in a dusty archive. He describes the shame of gnawing on raw roots, the gnawing emptiness that made even the most fervent prayers feel hollow, the constant fear that the next meal might be his last, or worse, that he would be too weak to fight when the enemy appeared. Damp earth and decaying vegetation is a constant reminder of the natural world's indifference to their plight. You can almost feel the gnawing emptiness in your own stomach, a phantom sensation mirroring their suffering. Day by day, this struggle for sustenance wasn't unique to the Third Crusade. It was a persistent, often underestimated, the entire era of the Crusades. Armies marched on empty stomachs, their campaigns dictated not by strategy alone, availability of food. The failure to secure adequate provisions could lead to mutiny, desertion, or outright defeat, regardless of the bravery of the soldiers. I discovered in archives studying the logistical records of the Fourth Crusade, inability to pay for provisions in Venice led to the diversion of the entire campaign to Constantinople, dating consequence of a fundamental failure in planning and resource management. The smell of the sea, usually a refreshing scent, with the faint, metallic tang of desperation. You can feel the damp chill emanating from the water. Stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the day. The cries of gulls overhead, usually a sign of bounty, seem to mock their meager rations. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting long, weary shadows across the encampment, hear the collective sigh of relief that another day has passed without utter starvation. The sounds of the camp begin to quiet, but the chirping of unseen insects and the rustling of the wind through dry grasses. You can feel the rough texture of the ground beneath your worn sandals. The faint, smoky scent of cooking fires, little comfort, signifies a temporary reprieve from the gnawing emptiness. This enduring lesson, reality of feeding armies in a pre-industrial world, stark reminder of the fundamental human need that underpins all grand endeavors, that resonates even today as we grapple with global food security and the intricate web of logistics that feeds our own interconnected world. Memory of their hunger, a visceral, almost tangible sensation, lingers, testament to the enduring power of history to teach us about ourselves. As darkness settles around you now, darkness that meant something completely different, not the gentle shroud that invites rest, but a primal darkness that emanated from an empty stomach, a void that echoed with the desperate cries of hunger. In your comfortable bed, but in the rough-spun tunic of a weary pilgrim, the coarse fabric scratching against your skin, reminder of the world's indifference. The air, acrid stench of unwashed bodies, and the ever-present metallic tang of dried blood offers no solace. Instead, faint maddening aroma of distant, unobtainable feasts, roasted meats, freshly baked bread, fruits, ghosts of sustenance that taunt your famished senses. The world around you evolves, the immediate discomfort to a deeper, more pervasive suffering. You are in the year of our Lord 1099. Somewhere in the parched lands between Antioch and Jerusalem, the sun, a relentless orb in a sky bleached of color, bakes the very earth, cracked to dusty canvas. Your mouth is a desert, your tongue a swollen, leathery thing. The water you carry, rationed, tastes of leather and desperation. It does little to quench the fire in your throat. You remember, a clarity that pierces through the haze of exhaustion, the promises made back in Clermont. Tales of fertile lands, flowing with milk and honey, of a divine reward for those who would reclaim the holy city. But the reality is brutal. The land here is unforgiving, a barren expanse where even weeds struggle to take root. Abundance is a cruel mirage, receding with every agonizing step. You are part of a vast, disorganized throng, desperation woven from disparate threads of faith, ambition, and sheer escapism. Peasants, etched with the hardship of a life spent toiling the soil, march alongside burghers, fine clothes now tattered and stained. Even a few disillusioned knights, their armor rusting and their spirits dimmed, their dreams of glory replaced by the gnawing pangs of hunger. You've seen men, strong men, scavenging for roots and grubs. You've witnessed mothers sharing a single withered fig with their skeletal children, hollowed with a grief that transcends physical pain. The constant low hum of suffering is the soundtrack to your existence. Brother Thomas, a voice rasps, pulling you from your reverie. It is Jean, a fellow pilgrim from the north, his face gaunt, unnaturally bright with fever. He clutches a small, leather-bound book, its pages brittle and stained. He whispers, his voice barely audible above the wind. A treatise on edible plants. The abbot himself gave it to me. His soul. You lean closer, your own stomach twisting with a desperate hope. Jean carefully turns the pages, tracing the crude illustrations. Here, he points to a drawing of a bulbous root. This is said to be edible, correctly boiled for a long time, then pounded into a paste. Your gaze drifts to a patch of scraggly, unfamiliar vegetation clinging to the dusty earth. Could that be it? The thought of chewing on something, anything, is almost intoxicating. The fear is also present, the fear of poisoning, of mistaking a deadly foe for sustenance. The stories of men who ate the wrong berries and succumbed to agonizing deaths, their bodies racked with convulsions. Jean continues, his voice filled with a desperate, almost manic excitement, speaks of certain insects as a source of protein. You recoil slightly. The very thought makes your gorge rise. consuming creatures that crawl and scuttle in the dirt is anathema to everything you've ever known. Yet, look at Jean's emaciated frame, at the desperation in his eyes, you understand. Survival has become a brutal, unsentimental calculus. The world around you evolves, the focus shifting to the grim realities of foraging. You spend hours, your hands raw and bleeding, roots that offer little more than bitter sustenance. You boil them in your meager pot, the water turning a murky brown and uninviting. Each mouthful is a victory, a small act of defiance against the encroaching emptiness. Later, a small group of merchants, their caravans laden with precious goods, their face is a mixture of pity and disdain. They are on their way back, their mission accomplished, their coffers full. One of them, a portly man with a greasy beard, catches your eye. He calls out, his voice booming, still marching towards that promised land. What folly is this? Look at yourselves! Shadows. Jane, emboldened by his newfound knowledge, steps forward. We march for God, sir. The merchant laughs, grating sound. God is in the coins in my purse, young man. The fat pigeons I'll be eating tonight. He gestures to a sack slung over his shoulder, from which emanates the faint, tantalizing aroma of freshly baked bread. Your stomach clenches. I have some bread, the merchant continues, his eyes glinting, but a good hearty loaf. But it will cost you. What have you to offer? You have nothing. Your possessions were lost or stolen weeks ago. While strong, cannot be bartered for a crumb. Jean, however, fumbles in his tattered tunic and produces a small, carved wooden bird. It was a gift from his daughter. Take this. Jean pleads, his voice cracking. It is all I have. The merchant snatches the bird, examines it with a practiced eye, and then tosses it back. Worthless. Keep your trinkets, pilgrim, and your hunger. He turns and walks away, his caravan disappearing into the dusty haze, the bitter taste of rejection and the phantom scent of bread. You realize then, with a chilling certainty, the enemy you face is not the Saracen warrior, nor the unforgiving desert, but the gnawing, relentless emptiness within. Of eating something so fundamental, so instinctual, has become a luxury, a distant memory. The taste of food, simple pleasure of a full stomach, is a forgotten language. I discovered in the archives, through fragmented accounts and desperate pleas for aid, that during the siege of Antioch in 1098, Satyrs resorted to eating horse flesh, dogs, and even their own dead. The stench of decay mingled with the stench of starvation, symphony of suffering. One chronicler wrote of men gnawing on their own arms, driven to such madness by hunger. The world around you evolves, the gnawing hunger becoming a dull ache, then a sharp, insistent pain, and finally a deep, all-consuming void, yourself staring at your own hands, imagining them as sustenance, a desperate, primal thought that chills you to the bone. Tapestry of life has been reduced to the stark, brutal imperative of survival. You recall a passage from a recovered diary. Young man named Thomas of Soissons, who wrote of his desperate attempts to find edible roots, describes the overwhelming exhaustion that made even the simplest tasks feel monumental. My body, he wrote, as a hollow shell, and my mind a flickering candle threatened by the slightest breeze of despair. As you continue your arduous journey, focus shifts from the immediate pangs of hunger to the psychological toll it takes. Once bound, you together begins to fray. Suspicion and resentment fester as men hoard what little they find. Manity eroded by the constant struggle, you see the glint of desperation in their eyes, desperate hunger that burns within you. The very concept of food, once a source of comfort and joy, has become a symbol of suffering, reminder of what has been lost. The thought of a simple meal, a humble loaf of bread, is now a profound longing. Transcends mere physical need. It is a yearning for normalcy, for the simple dignity of being nourished. As the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, you huddle with John and a few others around a sputtering fire. The air is still, the only sound the crackling of the dry wood. Jean offers you a small shriveled piece of root. You accept it, your hand trembling as you bring it to your lips. The taste is bitter, earthy, and utterly devoid of pleasure. Yet, you chew it slowly, savoring the meager sustenance. The world around you evolves, the focus softening, the edges of your awareness blurring. The gnawing hunger, still present, recedes slightly, replaced by a profound weariness. You close your eyes, the taste of the bitter root lingering on your tongue. The darkness that settles around you now is not the darkness of an empty stomach, embrace of exhaustion. You can almost feel the phantom warmth of a hearth, hear the distant murmur of voices, and perhaps dream of the simple, profound comfort of a warm loaf of bread.